Serial killers. Every true crime buff knows all about them, and they often debate who the worst of the worst actually is. Ted Bundy's trial was probably the most highly publicized in history, and Jeffrey Dahmer's twisted appetites were tabloid fodder for years. Neither of them, however, reached the shocking number of murders that one serial killer reached in the Pacific Northwest. He stalked Washington for decades, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. The media called him the Green River Killer, and he almost got away with everything. It was the early 1980s in King County, Washington, and horror was about to come to the winding Green River. The long river snakes from the rural areas of northwest Washington to the bustling city of Seattle and forms the approach to the former logging area of Stampede Pass. But for a group of children playing along the river on July 15, 1982, it would be the end of innocence. They discovered the body of Wendy Caulfield, a 16-year-old from nearby Puyallup, floating in the river. An investigation quickly began, but no leads were found to her killer. Wendy was likely the first to die, but she would be far from the last. It was just over a month later when 4 more bodies of young women would be found in the Green River. It was clear the Pacific Northwest had a serial killer on its hands. A massive task force was formed, the biggest since the hunt for Ted Bundy in the previous decade. Many more bodies would follow, all of them young women, many of them runaways and sex workers. But it would be a long time before the police had answers, despite them intersecting with the killer many times in the decades that followed. Who was this serial killer striking fear in the whole region? His name was Gary Ridgway, and he was one of the most effective and dangerous killers the country had ever seen. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1949, Gary Ridgway seemed like a normal boy, but under the surface there were early signs that he was disturbed. He was a middle child with a strict, domineering mother. He struggled in school, battling with dyslexia, and was held back a year in high school. Evidence later showed his IQ was only in the 80s, but there were darker signs. His father was an angry man, a bus driver who frequently complained about sex workers along his route. Ridgway had a problem with bedwetting, and his mother humiliated him after every episode. Gary Ridgway's journey to becoming a killer would begin early, when he was still a teenager. Ridgway liked hurting things from an early day, starting with shooting birds with a BB gun. But he had a taste for bigger prey, and one day when he was still in high school, he approached a random 6-year-old boy with a knife and stabbed him, deep enough to injure the boy's liver. The boy, who asked to remain anonymous, remembers asking Ridgway, "Why did you kill me?" He survived but spent several weeks in the hospital. Ridgway was never caught for the attack, and the victim realized years later that he had almost become the first murder victim of the Green River Killer. What made Ridgway so dangerous? He knew how to bide his time. After his first foray into attempted murder, Ridgway seemed to be slipping back into normal life. He graduated high school, married his high school girlfriend Claudia Craig, and joined the Navy. It was 1969 and he was soon sent to Vietnam. But while wartime was a formative experience for many young men, for Ridgway it would lead him further down the path to becoming a serial killer. Like many young soldiers, he had frequent sex with local sex workers, contracting gonorrhea. This enraged him, but not enough to stop doing it. And when he returned from Vietnam, he discovered his wife had been having an affair, leading to the end of their marriage. The combination of Ridgway's resentment toward his mother and his wartime experiences were about to collide. He soon married again, a woman named Marcia Winslow, and had a son. But she noticed disturbing signs of the monster he would become. Sometimes he was pious, obsessively reading the Bible aloud and preaching to the neighbors. Other times he would become inexplicably violent, even putting Marcia in a chokehold at one point. He would get randomly emotional, crying during sex, and if there was one thing he loved talking about, it was sex. He would frequently demand it, sometimes in a public place, and he was obsessed with the local sex workers. He seemed to hate them and want them out of his neighborhood, but he couldn't seem to stop patronizing them. His anger and obsession built until it exploded in a cocktail of violence. No one knows why Gary Ridgway decided to start killing, but when he did, he acted like he had been planning it all his life. He stalked Seattle and Tacoma, primarily among Pacific Highway South, where young sex workers and teen runaways could easily be found. He had a manipulative go-to move, a picture of his son that he always kept on him. He would introduce himself to the woman he had decided to target, showing them a picture of his son to get them to trust him and let down their defenses. He'd invite them into his truck. It would be the last decision they ever made. Sometimes Ridgway would drive them home, sometimes he would drive them to the woods, sometimes he'd decide to do the deed right there. But what came next was always the same, and his chosen victim would have sex, and midway through, he would make his move. He wrapped his forearm around their neck and pulled as hard as he could, killing them from strangulation. He would then drive them to a dumping ground and hide their bodies. He started in the Green River, but eventually started dumping bodies in more wooded areas and near the local airport. When asked how many young women he had killed over the years by investigators later, he would simply answer, "I lost count." Despite his low IQ, Ridgway was a highly competent killer. He knew exactly how to hide kills, spreading out the bodies and transporting some across state lines. He would sometimes contaminate the bodies with pieces of evidence he had taken off other people, like gum, cigarettes, and even written notes. He would sometimes pose the bodies naked before burying them, and he remembered where every body was, because sometimes he liked to return to them and dig them up so he could engage in necrophilia. It seemed like the perfect crime wave, but not quite. The police were onto Gary Ridgway surprisingly early. It was April 30th, 1983, and Ridgway had just taken his latest victim, Marie Malvar. But Malvar didn't vanish unnoticed. Ridgway's pickup truck had been sighted by her boyfriend, and the man chased down Ridgway, reporting him to the police. The police interrogated him, and Ridgway denied any involvement in Malvar's disappearance. They let him go, but it wouldn't be the last time he had contact with the Green River Task Force. But the next time, he would come looking for them. It was May 1984, and the toll of victims kept on rising, with 42 bodies being found in the area. The task force received a call from Gary Ridgway claiming to have information. He was still on the radar of the officers after their last encounter, and they made him pass a polygraph test before they'd work with him. He passed, denying any involvement in the killings. This would make experts later think he was a sociopath who could lie so convincingly he wouldn't be flagged by a lie detector. The task force would look at Ridgway again, but he would keep on slipping away. As the bodies kept showing up near Green River, the task force became desperate. Experts Robert Keppel and David Reichert, both of whom had been involved in previous hunts for serial killers, even interviewed Ted Bundy on death row for his insight into the Green River killer's psychology. He identified many of Ridgway's patterns and told him to stake out one of the graves to see if Ridgway returned. But Ridgway was good at biding his time. While many serial killers escalate until they get caught, Green River had a pattern and he stuck to it. His third wife, Judith Mawson, who he married in 1985, realized years later that he'd been pulling off killings right under her nose. When the carpet disappeared, she didn't give it a second thought until investigators told her he had likely removed it to wrap up a body. His irregular working hours were a cover for him leaving to hunt his victims and dispose of their bodies. She was contacted by authorities in 1987 as they renewed their interest in Ridgway and took DNA samples from him, but she never had even heard of the Green River Killer. This was also the period where Ridgway killed the fewest women, and Mawson claimed he had never been violent with her. Was he truly in love and able to suppress his darkest instincts, or was he just waiting to strike again? Gary Ridgway's reckoning would have to wait more than a decade when the DNA samples collected in 1987 were finally analyzed by a state-of-the-art DNA lab. This time they turned up a match and the task force had finally cornered the Green River Killer. Ridgway was keeping a low profile working at a truck factory, and his co-workers must have been very confused when their workplace turned into the biggest police raid the country had seen in a long time. They swept in and arrested Ridgway, charging him with 4 of the murders, only the first they had been able to link him to. It was going to be the trial of the century, or would it? When a prolific serial killer is arrested, most would expect him to be held in the most high-security prison possible. That wasn't the case here, as a little over a year into his pre-trial detention, Ridgway was moved to a medium-security prison. Soon it was announced that he had reached a plea deal with prosecutors. In exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table, Ridgway would plead guilty, receive life in prison, and name every single one of his victims to give closure to the families. The true scale of the Green River Killer's crimes were about to be revealed. In total, Gary Ridgway pled guilty to the murders of 48 women, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. He was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years for evidence tampering for every victim. He won't be getting out of prison ever again unless somehow he discovers the fountain of youth in his prison toilet. With the new evidence he gave them in prison interviews, police were able to track down the bodies of many of his carefully hidden victims around Washington and near Portland, Oregon, giving closure to grieving families decades later. So is Gary Ridgway the worst serial killer in American history? That depends on who you ask. Ridgway's confirmed 48 killings puts him at the top tier, and he's confessed to killing 71 women in total, although many of the others are unconfirmed. He continues to be cooperative with investigators as they look into missing person cases from the time period he may be linked to, but he's not the only serial killer who claims to have a horrifyingly high death toll. Samuel Little, another prolific serial killer doing life in prison in California, traveled the country weaving a career of mayhem from 1970 to 2012. constantly in and out of prison for crimes ranging from drunk driving to armed robbery. He was convicted of only 4 murders in California and Texas. The FBI thinks differently. The federal investigators have linked Little to 50 murders around the country, which would eclipse Ridgway's mark if proven accurate. But many of those killings happened decades ago and don't match a specific serial killer's MO. Little also targeted women, but didn't have as uniform a technique as Ridgway. If you ask Little, he'll tell you a different story. He boasts killing over 90 people, but many cannot be confirmed. So who is the worst serial killer in American history? Both men are doing life in prison. Both claim many more killings than they've been convicted of. Both are in their senior years, and the odds are the truth will go with both men to their graves. If you ask the people around the Green River in Washington, they'll tell you that Ridgway's reign of terror is something they'll never forget. The year is 1893, and on a chilly day in October, you finally arrived at your destination, the famed Windy City of Chicago. You're here to visit the World's Fair, an event that will be remembered for all its glory for many years to come. What you don't know is that the smooth-talking gentleman you just met on the street will also go down in history, but not for anything good. This man with a grand handlebar mustache, who's sporting a rather dapper bowler hat, will become known as one of America's most cunning and murderous scammers. You're the prey, and he's the predator, and you are soon going to experience a nightmare beyond anything you could imagine. You've just unwittingly agreed to spend the night in his demon trap, what will become known as a real-life house of horrors, aka Murder Castle. To give you an insight into how this guy worked, let's carry on with this fictional meeting, which is based on true events. The man you've just met introduced himself as H.H. Holmes, although what you don't know is that his real name is Herman Webster Mudgett. He's just 32 years old, but while still young, he's been through a lot and done a lot of bad things. He's smartly dressed, you could say immaculately dressed, a fop or a dandy as they might have said back then. He's articulate and intelligent and comes across as a man of the world, sophisticated, and as you've just found out, charitable. What a kindness to invite an out-of-towner to stay at his house. This is what you see anyway. The truth is, this man comes from a working-class background he'd rather deny ever happened. Like many serial killers, he was beaten by a violent father and picked on by a mother who took her devoutness a little too far. He took his anger out on animals and may have even practiced some amateur dissection on them. Mr. Holmes married young at just age 16, and a few years later he enrolled at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He studied anatomy, which will serve him well in his criminal future. He was unsettled though, and it seems he always strayed to the dark side. His wife soon left after he took his hand to her once too often. While there were rumors he might have had something to do with the disappearance of a young boy, this remains a rumor. What is true is that while working with dead bodies when studying anatomy, he began making false insurance claims on those bodies. He might even have experimented on some bodies, but we can't be sure of that. In short, he went from job to job after that. He married again while not even divorced to the previous wife, and carried on with his life as a trickster. The likely reason he left for Chicago was because while working in a drugstore, a boy who he'd prescribed drugs to died. Throughout his life, people around him would go missing or mysteriously die. This doesn't bode well for you. Now we're back in the street and you've just been invited by Dr. Henry H. Holmes, who claims to be a pharmacist, to stay at his house. To your surprise though, this is not just a house. This building takes up almost an entire block on Chicago's 63rd and Wallace Streets. Wow, you think. This erudite man of high esteem must have made a ton of money in the medical profession. You could say he did, but not in the way you'd imagine. His business wasn't saving lives, it was taking them, or at least exploiting the dead. This house is kind of ugly, and Dr. Holmes tells you he's been renovating as of late, hoping to turn it into the World's Fair Hotel. It's just about done, but you don't see any guests yet. There are some people milling around and others working in a drugstore, but the place seems eerily quiet. By the way, from that drugstore, Holmes would market fake cures for alcoholism and then also say he'd had tapped in a miracle spring. This water, he said, could cure all kinds of ailments. The pump led right to the drugstore, but Holmes had actually just illegally tapped into the water mains. He tells you there are over 50 rooms and proceeds to take you to one of them. You must be suffering from the enervating travails of travel, he says to you, which you don't quite understand. Hey, you spent most of your childhood helping out your pop on the pig farm. Perhaps I can offer you an inebriant. An anodyne for the weary traveler? You stare at him blankly. Would you like a drink? He says. Ah, okay, why not? You reply, ashamed of your pitiful intelligence. You now hate pigs. You take the drink, a special cocktail he tells you, something he created just for the World's Fair. You put down your bags and start to drink. A tonic, he tells you. Or shall we call it a tincture? He says you'll soon be refreshed, ready for the resplendence of what awaits you at this fair. This trip could not have been any better, you think. Who said city folk weren't kind? Your eyes feel heavy, and you tell Dr. Holmes you might want to rest for a while. Sleep, he whispers. You'll get some rest. Tomorrow is a big day for you. You wake up in the middle of the night with a bit of a headache. Your bags are gone, so you assume the kind doctor has just stored them somewhere for you. You're gasping for water, and so decide to make a visit to the bathroom. It's hard to see in the dark, and there are few lights turned on. You follow a set of stairs that are to the right of the door, only when you get to the bottom of them, there's just a wall. Strange, you think? Maybe he didn't finish that renovation. You walk back up to the landing and try to walk the other way, when again, you find some winding stairs. You walk to the bottom of them and there are two doors. You try one and behind it is a wall. This guy really needs to fire some contractors, you think. You try the next door, and just as you step inside it, it closes behind you. When you try and open it, you find it's locked. In this room, there are no windows. You bang on walls and it seems they're very thick. It's so stuffy in this room. There's hardly any ventilation at all. Then suddenly you smell something, like gas. It seems to be coming from a small grate. What the hell? Then you notice a kind of door fixed to the floor, like a trap door. You open that and it seems there's some kind of chute. If there's a gas leak, you better get out of the room, so you climb into the chute. Only when you get to the end of that chute, you're confined in a room just a bit bigger than a coffin. You hear a locking sound above you. There's nowhere for you to go. You can't breathe. And that's it, you're dead. What might have happened after this, when Dr. Holmes was sure you were dead, is the coffin room opened at the bottom and you fell into another room in the basement. In this room, he has his tools: knives, saws, scalpels, acids. He has his workbench and other chutes that lead to a lime pit and a crematorium. That's where some of your bones will later be discovered. You made the mistake of staying with a man who would later say, "I was born with the very devil in me. The inclination to murder came to me as naturally as the inspiration to do right comes to the majority of persons." How many people did he kill? It's hard to say. He might have killed 200 people. He confessed to 27, but evidence for only 9 murders were ever found. In that basement of his, there were signs that he'd been hacking apart people for a long time, and not only for insurance purposes. Police believed he might have tortured some people before he killed them. They found the tools, saw, and the blood. He might have burned people alive in some rooms because police discovered a kind of flamethrower hidden in some walls, and those walls were packed with asbestos so the whole building wouldn't catch fire. They found other rooms with moving walls and no windows, where he may have simply starved people. In some of those rooms, they found peepholes. This is what the press would later call some of those rooms: asphyxiation chamber, no light with gas connections, blind room, sealed room all bricked in, 5-door room, and the dummy elevator for lowering bodies. We guess you found your way into the black closet. Maybe the worst find was something that looked like a torture rack. You see, Holmes was always the experimenter. He had created something called the elasticity determinator, which was basically a medieval rack a person could be stretched on. Holmes believed he could make a giant. He could slowly stretch a person and they'd become taller. How did this fiend evade arrest for so long? Well, firstly, the name change helped. After doing that, he could no longer be linked to his former scams. This was the 19th century. A man could disappear and reinvent himself. It was also later said that Holmes knew a lot about the law. He was ahead of the police. But a con artist's greatest skill is to make people believe they're not what they are, far from it. Holmes was skilled in the art of rhetoric. He used language that might impress someone whose education wasn't the best. He was also a skilled hypnotist. He was a manipulator, and appearances made him look as if he had money, lots of it. To the people in the street, he was a success story, a man of great intellect who could be trusted. If you're gonna scam people, wear a suit. He wasn't just glib and intelligent though, he was pleasant on the eye. One of his main schemes was to induce women to fall for him. They thought they'd met a well-educated, handsome fellow with bags of cash. Their chips were in. But it was he who would be taking them to the cleaners. Well, to the lime pit. Sometimes he might even strip the bodies of their flesh and sell the skeletons to medical labs. It's thought he lured plenty of young women to his castle, and many never made it out. But he was in debt with creditors and they wanted their cash. So he could pay them, he set fire to his castle and then tried to claim the insurance. An investigator named F.G. Cowie was on to Holmes, and he knew something of his sketchy past, and he soon became suspicious of Holmes's insurance claim as well as discovering other frauds. Holmes then got out of Chicago. How he was eventually caught is quite complicated. In 1894, police discovered the burned body of a Mr. B.F. Perry in a house on a street in Philadelphia. He was an inventor, and it was assumed that he might have blown himself up. That's what the crime scene indicated. In his pockets were letters, and they seemed to suggest that he'd come to Philadelphia from St. Louis and his wife would come to meet him soon. Then, sometime later, the Fidelity Mutual Life Association of Philadelphia got a letter, and it stated that the dead man was actually Benjamin F. Pitzel, and he was insured, and a Dr. H. Holmes was making a claim for $10,000. He listed the distinguishing marks and the body was dug up to see if they matched. They did, and Holmes got his cash. Holmes was apparently acting on behalf of the Pitzel family. Pitzel, by the way, had been Holmes's friend and partner in crime. Only a little later and things would come undone for Holmes. You see, he had spent some time in jail in another state for fraud. This was a man with his fingers in many crooked pies. While in jail, he told his cellmate of a scam and said, "If you help me get a lawyer, I'll let you in on the scam." He said his name was Howard. That scam involved faking the death of a B.F. Pitzel by dumping a body and then making an insurance claim on that dead body. He said, "If you help me out now, I'll give you some of the $10,000. It all gets crazy here because it seems Holmes double-crossed his partner, Mr. Pitzel, and did actually kill him. Why share the cash? Miss Pitzel was in on it too. We mean in on the scam. She was told that her husband would just hide. Holmes told her there was no need to go with him and identify the body. She would have seen it was really her spouse. He just kept telling her that her beloved husband was hiding and he'd take her to him soon. The cellie was never paid for his help. And so to get revenge, he told the cops about this guy called Howard and the scams he'd been doing. The cops knew it was Holmes they were after, and they soon found him in Boston. He was arrested for insurance fraud and the murder of Pitzel. Holmes at first admitted to the fraud but denied the murder. He was also wanted in another state for stealing a horse of all things. Holmes told the cops lots and lots of tall tales. He was trying anything to get out of what he'd done, and at one point even offered a guard $500 if he could hypnotize him. The guard said no. The cops also wanted to know the whereabouts of Miss Pitzel and her 5 kids. Holmes said he knew but kept lying. At different times, he said they moved to the UK, gone to South America, and were in Detroit. He'd actually murdered 3 of them. Miss Pitzel had left them with Holmes at one point, and later he told her he'd taken them to Indianapolis and they were staying with a widow. They were very safe, he told her, and then said her husband was now waiting for her in Montreal. All lies. He'd killed 3 of them. Mr. Pitzel's body was exhumed another time, and it was discovered that he hadn't died in an explosion but had been poisoned with chloroform. What's so ironic about this is that the insurance company believed Holmes had defrauded them. But for once in his life, the body was actually the real body. Now, it wasn't fraud though, it was murder. Holmes was eventually found guilty and hanged, but only for the murder of Mr. Pitzel in Philadelphia. He'd admitted to many more murders, and the police were well aware of what went down in the murder castle, but that's not what got him in the end. Had that cellie not told the cops Holmes's murder castle might have got a lot more guests who never left. He had one request before he was hanged. Dr. Holmes asked if he could be buried and encased in thick concrete. He didn't want anyone messing with his body after he'd passed. In his own words, he said he wanted the cement case to insure his body against the vandalism or scientific curiosity of ghouls. He didn't get what he wanted because he was exhumed in 2017 after rumors circulated that he'd actually escaped and not been hanged. The rumors were wrong. It was him, and his teeth proved it. History is full of people killing each other, and while the first serial killer to ever be recognized as such is believed to be a Roman woman during the 1st century AD, the first person to be recognized as a serial killer by his contemporaries was a French war hero, and his body count puts modern serial killers to shame. Gilles de Rais is believed to have been born in September 1405 during a very troubled time in France's history. Born into the very heart of the 100 Years' War, de Rais' family and his lands in Brittany were caught right in the middle of a struggle for the kingship of France. This was a hard time, which made for hard men with native French invading English and a mix of various other European powers all vying to support one side or the other and claim the largest kingdom in Western Europe for themselves. De Rais would not have a happy childhood. Despite he himself being a child prodigy, it's believed that by age 7 he was fluent in Latin and read both military and religious scripture, seeking to educate himself in military discipline, morals, and intellectual development. De Rais would follow in his father's footsteps and serve for the cause of French sovereignty. But his life was nearly derailed when it's believed that he witnessed his father killed. in a horrible hunting accident. Following the death of his mother, DeRay went into the care of his grandfather, who tried to marry him off to wealthy heiresses, one even as young as 4 years old, while DeRay himself was barely a teenager. Eventually, he was betrothed to a rich heiress while 15 years old, substantially increasing his family's wealth. Forced to grow up fast, DeRay entered the military service at the age of 16. Gaining great fame for his courage and loyalty, he was assigned to protect Joan of Arc in her campaign against the English, and was devastated at her execution in her trial for heresy. Despite his repeated personal tragedies, DeRay earned great wealth and prestige, becoming a national hero. Unfortunately, this national hero would come to harbor a very dark secret. Historians theorize that severe PTSD from his childhood trauma, the death of his close friend Joan of Arc, and decades of horrific medieval warfare took its toll on DeRay, leading him down dark paths. He began to exhibit antisocial behaviors and a deep depression, allegedly claiming that he no longer wanted to live. Looking to isolate himself, he moved to a remote castle deep in his barony, leaving even his wife behind. It would be here that one of France's darkest chapters would be written. DeRay had seemingly become obsessed with his own salvation and constructed a massive cathedral, the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. In biblical scripture, only children and mentally handicapped individuals are considered innocent, which would lead a particularly dark intonation to DeRay's private chapel. Right about this time, children began to go missing from the land surrounding DeRay's properties. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for nobles to simply take the children of peasants to raise them as their personal pages or assistants. Particularly lucky children might even be made into squires, giving them a shot at a slightly better life than normal. Yeah, next time you see someone making a big deal out of England's royal family, kindly remind them that these are the same people who could simply take a child from their parents' arms if they wished, and the parent would never expect to see or hear from them again. However, more children than could reasonably be expected to fulfill court duties in DeRay's estate were going missing, and rumors began to circulate of evil, magic, and even Satan worship. Having financed a luxurious cathedral and put on an extremely costly play based on the Siege of Orleans, which was lifted by his good friend Joan of Arc, DeRay was running into serious financial difficulties. He began to sell off property in order to continue funding his extravagant lifestyle. But in 1438, he turned to alchemy, hoping it could fix his financial woes. Growing even more obsessed with the occult, he also began to seek out witches and sorcerers, even experimenting with the summoning of demons straight from the pit of hell itself. Over the course of 8 years, hundreds went missing from Brittany, eventually most of them being blamed on DeRay himself. It was said he would host elaborate and lavish parties in his castle, then lead his guests to private rooms where he would hang them from the ceiling by their necks, then slice their throats open with a knife. His appetite for violence and sadism seemingly knew no bounds, and he unleashed all his fury on the young people of Brittany. By 1440, DeRay was coming ever more unraveled psychologically. His downfall began when he stormed into a local church and dragged a priest screaming and crying out in the middle of service. DeRay believed that the priest had cheated him on a business deal, but whatever evil plans he had for the man were thankfully stopped before he could carry them out. The kidnapping of the cleric prompted an investigation by church authorities, which quickly led them to discovering evidence of DeRay's sadism. A government investigation quickly followed, confirming the church's findings about DeRay's crimes, and he and his bodyguards were arrested on the 15th of September 1440. The charges against DeRay would be murder, sodomy, and heresy, and the trial to come would shock the nation that once viewed DeRay as a hero. Dozens of local parents testified before the court that their children had last been seen in the hands of DeRay's servants or going to his castle to beg for food before disappearing. A furrier testified that his young apprentice had been asked to go on a favor on behalf of 2 of DeRay's men, only to have the men later say they hadn't seen the boy and that he'd likely been kidnapped by thieves to be turned into a page. Even DeRay's former associates, some of who were involved in the grisly acts of violence, testified against him, shocking the witnesses and court officials. The testimony of what took place in DeRay's castle was so gruesome and lurid that the judges presiding over the case ordered most graphic pieces to be struck from the record, leaving us today with only a small picture of what really took place. Eventually, DeRay himself confessed to the crimes. For weeks, he had been adamant of his innocence, but in a sudden reversal, he confessed the deeds and asked for forgiveness. The court canceled a promised torture session after he confessed, and DeRay was found guilty by ecclesiastic court. Turned over to a secular court, DeRay was once more found guilty thanks to the testimony of 2 of his close confidants and bodyguards. All 3 men were sentenced to death by burning and hanging simultaneously, a punishment reserved for only the most vile of criminals. And on Wednesday, October 26th, DeRay and his 2 bodyguards were led to the gallows. Once there, the men had a noose fitted around their neck, and a brush was littered at their feet. Having asked to be executed first, DeRay encouraged his former bodyguards to seek forgiveness before being set on fire and hung. The two men would quickly follow. It's believed that DeRay killed between 100 and 200 young children and teenagers, the remains disposed of in the cistern, moat, and other hiding places after being burned up. However, throughout history, some believe that DeRay was actually innocent and the victim of a noble and church plot of revenge. In 1992, DeRay was retried using evidence from historical documents and exonerated of his crimes, though the trial was not held by historians, but rather by authors who had written on the subject. To this day, most historians agree that the detailed testimony against DeRay more than outweighs any hint of innocence, and that Gilles DeRay was without a doubt the first registered serial killer in history. There's a book that has been called by many the most comprehensive work on serial killers. It's called The Method and Madness of Monsters and was written in 2003-2004 by a man called Peter Vronsky. In the introduction, he explains one of the reasons why he started writing the book, telling the reader that one Sunday morning in 1979, he checked into a New York City hotel. He was momentarily irked by the fact someone had held the elevator on the top floor. When that person finally came down, he passed Vronsky. He had a bag in his hand. Years later, Vronsky would discover that two heads and body parts were in the bag. The mutilated torsos of the women whose heads belonged to were on fire in a room on the top floor. Vronsky later smelled burning, but he didn't know it was the smell of roasting flesh. That's our introduction to a man who could be the USA's most prolific serial killer. We say could, and we'll explain later why. First, let's start the story at the beginning. Before Cottingham got the title the New York Ripper, or the Butcher of Times Square, or the Torso Killer. How do you kill a torso? He was a young man from a middle-class family living in New Jersey. His father was a vice chairman at an insurance company, and his mother was a homemaker. By all accounts, the family was a loving one, except for the fact that the dad enjoyed binge drinking his weekends away at the local bars. It said the family was large, and Cottingham as a boy was always surrounded by lots of young people. Most of those people, however, were girls and women. Since his own family and relatives, we're told, were mostly of the fairer sex, Cottingham has said that he grew up doted on because of this and always received lots of attention. We know all of this because many years after Vronsky's book was written, he would go on to interview Cottingham. In an interview in 2018 with a Bangkok-based podcast called This Strange Life, Vronsky talked about those interviews and partly about Cottingham's childhood. By all accounts, he did indeed come from a normal, loving family. He did not fall into the category of what's called the McDonald triad. This is related to three things common in the childhood of serial killers. Those are cruelty to animals, setting fires, and constant bedwetting. If you're watching this and are now thinking, "Oh my god, that's me," don't worry, as Vronsky is quick to say that this is common for many kids. It just seems the triad is a feature in many serial killers' early lives. Cottingham loved animals, with Vronsky saying he had homing pigeons as a boy. He loved animals and still does. He explained that he couldn't even kill one when he needed to be put down. He couldn't have possibly killed one of those homing pigeons, said Vronsky, but he didn't mind killing humans later in his life. In his book, Vronsky writes that Cottingham would drug, torture, and mutilate women, and whether they were dead or alive at the end of this, he didn't much care. It's said at times he made sure some women were dead, but that's only because he had known them and so wanted to get rid of their hands and heads so they could not be identified as a trail led back to him. What Cottingham would do is pick up women selling their bodies on the streets. And we must remember that back in the 1970s around New York, those women were plentiful. Young girls were traveling from all over the US to work the streets of a city which we might say were not paved with gold. If the women went with Cottingham, he might drug them and torture him, and sometimes they might survive. But an awful lot, perhaps as many as 80 women, did not. Some sources say as many as 100. According to Vronsky, many of those women might have died during the mutilation and beating, and that it was not always Cottingham's intentions to kill them. They died on him, said Vronsky. The women were often tied up, and then Cottingham would start his process with his hands, teeth, and a bag of tools. We cannot go into details, but those details are nothing short of horrific. "I have a problem with women," Cottingham once said, and that might be the understatement of the century. It's said that many of the women that did survive this ordeal didn't report it, mostly because they were already doing illegal things. Some did, some didn't, but Cottingham was never under suspicion. He was, for the most part, invisible, an American psycho, a man with 3 kids who loved him, and a very normal family life. 1 hour he might be standing over his small child as she blew out her birthday cake candles, and the next hour he might be dismembering one of his victims. According to the experts, Cottingham was what is referred to as a sadistic killer, a person who derives excitement from the process of causing extreme pain, a person who gets off on the woman's expression during her ordeal. The type of killer doesn't often care about the coup de grace, the death blow, the process where the other killers get all their pleasure. Murder is often just a way to prevent capture by the police. Ask what Cottingham, now an old man in bad shape, is like now. Vronsky says he's very shy. He had given just 1 interview before he spoke with Vronsky, with the reason likely being he didn't want exposure as it would hurt his 3 children. They no longer visit him, not after he admitted what he'd done. "What's he like? Evil?" asks the interviewer in Bangkok. "He's a great guy," replies Vronsky, surprising his interlocutor. But this is how it often works, because serial killers might need to be charming to lure people into their web. "I could see why all those women trusted him," says Vronsky. He adds that Cottingham is amiable, intelligent, well-read, talkative, and yet, he adds, "You know you're sitting next to someone tremendously evil, someone who is open but at the same time deceptive." Vronsky says the psychologist 30 years ago said the same thing about Cottingham. The only reason he talked to Vronsky is a lurid story in itself. One of those women that Cottingham had decapitated in 1979 and then set fire on had a child. Forensics knew this because she had a scar where the cesarean had been performed. The child was adopted, and years later that child found out who her mother was. She subsequently read Vronsky's book and went to visit Cottingham in prison, after which she asked Vronsky to help her talk to him to retrieve any information pertaining to her mother. "As we speak," said Vronsky a few months ago when he did the interview, "police are trying to find the head. Cottingham had at least been helpful there. He's close to death now, and it seems he wants some kind of redemption. The problem is his memory has faded, and Cottingham has said he's never remembered the torture and killing part, but only his meticulous cleanup. He said during the time he was getting rid of evidence, he was in what he called the zone. He was rather good at evading detection by police, and he'd been doing it for a long time. Cottingham was only ever convicted of killing 5 women. Vronsky says that some serial killers have lied about the number of people they killed, but he believes Cottingham might be telling the truth about the number 80. Ongoing investigations have indeed found that he definitely did kill more people. But as for the 80 count, it just won't be possible to prove if that's true. He was just 21 when he committed his first murder in 1968, but the next murder he was charged with didn't happen until 1979. That's a big gap, and Cottingham has said he was prowling the streets finding and hurting women all that time. Many women, as he said, he didn't kill, but he says a lot of bodies of women found by police throughout the 70s were on him. He was bringing up children at the time of the murders, and those kids, we're told, loved him dearly. He did have 2 mistresses in New York, but apparently he was also very kind-hearted with them. In fact, it's said they thought he was very shy and often unable to manifest his more normal sexual desire on them. He held down a good job, and he was liked by those who knew him. So, how did he get caught, this invisible monster? According to Vronsky, he'd gotten sloppy. Police had been discovering dead women at hotels, each of them having been strangled and tortured. In 1980, Cottingham did this to one girl, and then just stuffed her under the bed in the hotel. She was later found by a maid covered in bite marks, badly beaten, throat slit with a knife. A maniac was on the loose. Then Cottingham just a short time later picked up another woman, and he took her to the same hotel. The staff didn't think anything of it. For some reason, they didn't remember Cottingham and the fact that he had gone there just 18 days before with the girl that ended up being killed. He took this girl to a room and told her he would like to give her a massage, and then he proceeded to hold her down, handcuff her, and torture her. She screamed, and she later said in court he had told her, "You have to take it. The other girls did. You have to take it too." But those screams had been heard, and because staff at the hotel were already shaken by what had happened before, they immediately called the police. Cottingham was caught red-handed, the girl still on the bed, alive. At Cottingham's side were replica pistols, slave collars, a knife, and lots of prescription drugs. Police wasted no time in searching Cottingham's house, and there they found trophies he'd collected from other women he had murdered. The game was up. It was an easy case to solve from there. As we said, he was only convicted of 5 murders in the end, but that number certainly isn't the number of his actual victims. Vronsky said during his visits with him, which are still ongoing, or at least they were not too long ago, he appears looking like Santa Claus with his portly figure and white beard. He uses a wheelchair, and now at the edge of his own life, Vronsky says he is in a confessional state. Not because he feels bad about what he did, according to Vronsky, but because he's hedging his bets on the afterlife. According to Vronsky, Cottingham says there's more to what he did that has not come out. He hints that no one knows exactly what he did, said Vronsky in the interview, and people will be shocked when they find out. Needless to say, Cottingham won't ever be getting out of prison. So there you have the story of a loving family man who had a double identity. A man who evaded arrest in part because he didn't fit the profile of what most of us would think is a maniac who's capable of doing the most despicable things to another human being. Maybe there were signs, but if that's true, no one talked about them. In time, most of us realized that the real monsters in life come with human faces, sometimes all too normal. The boy next door, the doting dad, the guy with the briefcase and business suit who spends his weekends watching his young kids play sports. Cottingham is perhaps the perfect example of a Jekyll and Hyde character. The year is 1871, and a lonesome traveler is making his way on horseback through the state of Kansas, hoping to head west where he's heard there's money to be made. As he's passing through the Great Osage Trail, drained after days navigating windswept plains, he comes across what looks like a quiet homestead. There he meets the Bender family, an odd-looking group of people if there ever was one. Unbeknownst to the weary traveler, Old Man Bender has quite the reputation among the few families that live in the remote area. What do people say about him? They call him a hideous brute, ill-tempered, repulsive. As for Mrs. Bender, she's called a midnight hag with murderous ambition. Indeed, after his belly was full of stew and his head had hit the pillow, the traveler's life came to an abrupt end. He was found some days later dumped near a creek with his throat slashed and his skull crushed. This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first serial killer family. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. This was a time in U.S. history when European settlers were trying to make a go of it in the sometimes quite remote and unforgiving parts of America. The Bender family was no exception. They arrived in Osage in northwestern Labette County in the year 1870, along with a handful of other families. The locals didn't exactly welcome them with open arms, but neither did they turn their backs to them. They were just another bunch of folks that were gonna see just how hard it was settling in such a harsh environment. It was just too much for some of the new families and they packed up and left quickly. But the Benders were made of tough stuff. They weren't going anywhere. John Bender Sr. made a claim on some land adjacent to the Great Osage Trail, which would later become known as the Santa Fe Trail. It was Native Americans who forged the trail, but it was Europeans who would name it the Osage Trail. If a person back then wanted to move west along an open road, then they had to pass through this trail and at some point come close to the warped homestead of the Bender family. The Benders soon got their hands dirty and built a barn, a corral, and a cabin. The cabin had 2 rooms, only separated by the cloth of a wagon cover. They made a kitchen and they converted part of their cabin into a general store and a place a traveler could have a bite to eat. On top of that, they made a small compartment where someone could rest their head for the night. You could call it a bed, but it deserved to be called a butcher's block. So who were the Benders exactly? Well, we know that John Bender Sr., aka Pa, could barely speak a word of English. We knew that he grunted a lot, and to those who met him, he was seen as something of a brute. They were right. Mrs. Bender, Elvira, aka Ma, was said to be equally unfriendly, and while better than her husband, her English wasn't perfect. Both her and John communicated most of the time in German. She was sometimes called a she-devil, but not because of her appearance, but because along with her daughter, she told anyone in the area that she had psychic powers and could even communicate with the dead. That daughter, Kate Bender, was the only family member who was fluent in English, and so she was very useful when it came to writing and distributing flyers that explained that she and her mother were advocates of spiritualism and could heal the sick with their supernatural powers. As for the son, John Jr., word on the street was, or shall we say the trail, was that he was a half-wit, a young man prone to sudden outbreaks of laughter for no apparent reason. Some sources state that the brother and sister were not actually related but a married couple. This is the problem with the story of the Benders. The family was something of a mystery. There was never any documentation stating that they were German immigrants. This was just taken for granted. It may or may not have been true, just as the rumor that Mrs. Bender had actually come from the Adirondack Mountains in New York State and that she'd killed previous husbands might not have been true. They were a weird bunch, a family that promoted free love who claimed that they could talk to dead spirits. For that reason, they were gossiped about a lot. It didn't help their reputation when Kate Bender gave lectures on spiritualism, and during those lectures she would sometimes say that murder might not be such a bad thing and might actually be a brave and noble act. She also advocated free love, saying that staying with one partner alone was just the miserable requirements of self-constituted society. Notably, she also once said in one of her lectures, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their proper sway? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." As you can imagine, folks that lived near the Benders were somewhat apprehensive about making friends with them. You had the brute of a father, his wicked wife, the idiot son, and a daughter that claimed she was in contact with the dead and didn't believe in any kind of sexual propriety. They were outcasts, strange-sounding pariahs living in the middle of nowhere, and so people kept their distance. But travelers, people looking for a new life in the American West, they knew nothing about the Bender family. They just wanted a place to rest their head for a night or two and a good meal to restore their energy. The Bender homestead was like an oasis to these travelers, and they were only too happy to have a place to stay, to be able to fill their wagons with food, water, gunpowder, booze, and tobacco. Not only that, they were reportedly entranced by Kate's good looks and her way with words. "Come rest," she told them. "I will heal you with my psychic powers." Healing was far from the truth. Traveling down that trail was not for the meek. Not only could a person or a group of people starve out there, but they needed their strength and they needed weapons if they should come into contact with bandits or unfriendly Native Americans. Let's not forget that many groups were traveling with everything they owned. That's why when the young man we described in the beginning of this story was found with his throat slashed and his head caved in, it wasn't exactly a big shock to people. Everyone knew that the trail was a treacherous place, and one could easily be set upon by a gang who wanted what was in their wagon. In 1871, 72, and 73, people went missing, always close to where the Benders lived. The locals at the time grew quite worried. People were told not to go out on the trail alone or at night, but no one suspected that it was the Bender family that was behind the strange disappearances. In fact, mobs at times would accuse some man down on his luck and proceed to chase him out of town. They would soon discover that they'd been chasing away the wrong people. In March 1873, a physician from Independence, Kansas named Dr. William York alighted a train in Cherryvale, a town not too far from the Osage Trail. This guy was a person of standing, so when he went missing, it was big news. What was he doing in the middle of nowhere, you might ask? York had made the journey because he was looking for two people that had gone missing. Those two folks had been acquainted with York and he was determined to find them. The friend was George Newton Longcore, and he was accompanied by his young daughter, Mary Ann. They left Independence with the hope of resettling in Iowa, except they didn't get very far. They found the Osage Trail and later disappeared. We know that on his quest to find his friend and his friend's daughter, that York arrived at the place called Fort Scott in Kansas. We know that on March 9th he left that place, and we also know that he never made it home from there. What the Bender family didn't know is that they had now bitten off more than they could chew. You see, Mr. York wasn't just a man of standing. His two brothers were also extremely powerful people. One was a colonel in the military and the other was a member of the Kansas State Senate. Those two guys were obviously upset that their brother had vanished into thin air, a brother that had been looking for other people that had vanished. While the brothers at first thought that the disappearances might have been down to attacks by Native Americans, they also wondered if some of those homesteads contained something quite insidious. What they were about to discover was something way more evil than they had bargained for, something that would shock America for many years to come. They got 50 guys together and went out to visit those homesteads, arriving along the tracks like a small army. At one point, the group, led by the brother who was a colonel in the U.S. Army, arrived at Bender's place. He spoke to the family, well, as best he could do since the older Benders were terrible with English, and he was told that his brother had stayed the night with them, but he'd left the next day. The Benders told the colonel that the trail was fraught with danger and his brother might have come across dangerous natives. There was just something wrong about the family, and Colonel York grew more suspicious when he learned that Mrs. Bender had recently threatened someone with a knife. We know that it did indeed happen because the newspaper clipping still exists today. The colonel went back and again asked, "Do you know where my brother is?" He was rather less friendly this time. Mrs. Bender was enraged that the men were back, while Kate Bender told him that she'd use her clairvoyant skills to find the missing man. At that point, the colonel and his men were pretty sure that this family were not what they claimed to be. In fact, some of the men in the group said that they were guilty and should be hanged. But the colonel needed more evidence before he sent a family to the gallows, and they went to talk to more people in nearby communities. Weeks passed, and then one local noticed something strange. He passed the Bender house and realized that the place seemed to be abandoned. It looked like the Benders had just taken off, leaving some of their animals behind. That man reported what he'd seen to the members of the township, and soon the colonel heard about the missing family. Due to terrible weather, it took some days to go out and search for the Benders, but in the end, a search party of several hundred people was formed. When they got to the Bender house, they discovered that it was pretty much empty of clothes and provisions. All that had been left behind was something that smelled awful, as if a decaying body was under the floorboards. The men found a trap door that was bolted shut, but they soon managed to wrestle it open. The door led to a dark room under the house, and there they saw blood splattered everywhere, some of it not so old. The group moved to the cabin, and they started digging, thinking that bodies must be buried. Later that evening, they found Dr. York's decomposing body. He'd been buried in the nearby orchard. The next day, they found another 8 bodies buried in shallow graves. When they looked down the well, they found another body as well as various body parts. It was a horror show, a terrible thing to behold. Some of the bodies had been mutilated, while the body of a young girl didn't seem to have been injured at all. The group suspected that the family had buried her alive. In all, the Benders might have killed as many as 21 people, although a more conservative estimate is 11. The Benders had a few good friends in that area, but suffice to say the now growing crowd of people weren't too kind to folks that had known the family. One man was hanged just because he knew them, although the crowd pulled him down and he survived. The media arrived at the Bender place, coming from as far away as New York City and Chicago. The public came from far and wide, all wanting to look at the place where the evil had lived. Rewards were offered to anyone who could locate the family, which in today's money were around $20,000 and $40,000. But where were the Benders? Well, vigilantes wanted that reward, with some claiming they had caught up with the family and killed them all. Some claimed they shot and buried them, others said they shot and threw them in the river, but these were all likely lies. No bodies were found and no reward was given. The Benders were either very good at hiding or they were all 6 feet under. The reward then went up to more than $60,000 in today's money, but still no one could find them. As this was happening, the story spread to every state. Books were written, including one called The Five Fiends or The Bender Hotel Horror in Kansas. It wasn't easy finding this family for the simple fact that not much was known about them. Were the parents legally married? Were the children even their children? Were they even called Benders? It was soon speculated that Mr. Bender was actually named John Flickinger, and that Mrs. Bender had likely been married several times. Worse, her husbands always seemed to end up dead with wounds to the head, and it was likely that Kate and John Jr. were the children of some of those men, and their real names were Eliza Griffith and John Gebhardt. Where did they all go? We just don't know. Their story remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in U.S. history. Maybe they were killed by an angry posse, but if they were, no bodies were ever recovered and no one claimed that handsome reward. They might also have moved west, started another life, and then filled the ground with more bodies. Maybe their descendants are living next door to you right now, just waiting to carry on their murderous legacy. Could this be the face of the Zodiac Killer? October 6, 2021, the nonprofit group The Casebreakers, a team of 40 independent investigators devoted to cold cases, made the bombshell announcement. After more than 53 years of speculation, expert and amateur theories, the Zodiac Killer could finally be identified. His name? Gary Francis Post. We've talked about the Zodiac Killer a lot, but just in case you need a refresher, for 10 months from December 20th, 1968 to October 11th, 1969, 5 people were murdered in the San Francisco Bay Area. The first 2, David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were teenagers, shot to death on Lake Herman Road in Benicia. Next, on July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron and Mike Majou were shot while parked in Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Majou survived, Farron did not. An anonymous caller notified the police, taking responsibility and also confessing to the Benicia murders. On August 1st, 3 letters were sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, taking credit for the crimes and demanding publication. That meant including a 3-part cryptogram that the writer claimed would reveal his identity. On August 7th, he wrote a subsequent letter giving details only the police could corroborate, and naming himself the Zodiac. On September 27th, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard were attacked by a hooded man at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. They were tied up, then stabbed multiple times. Hartnell survived, Shepard did not. 2 weeks later, on October 11th, cab driver Paul Stein was shot in the head in Presidio Heights. 3 teens witnessed the killer leave the cab. The Zodiac later wrote taking credit and proved it by enclosing a piece of Stein's bloody shirt. While there have been no confirmable Zodiac murders since, he continued a correspondence with the police and press, claiming 37 kills. So, why do the case breakers think Post is their guy? According to the official press release, it's been years in the making. They identify, quote, outlaw-turned-Zodiac whistleblower Will, unquote, who claims he was part of a posse run by Post near High Sierra mountain range in California. Will said he even saw Post bury a cache of weapons used in the Zodiac killings up in the mountains. He tried for years to convince authorities Post was the killer, but no one seemed interested, until he met California news anchor Dale Hulin. Dale heard Will's story and brought it to the attention of the casebreakers. Subsequent eyewitnesses agree. These include a former neighbor whom Post and his wife used to babysit, who claims that as a toddler she was taken by Post to the nearby woods and taught how to shoot. He even gave her a .22 pistol of her own and made similar gifts to members of his posse. The organization's intel expert Eric Kleinsmith says one witness saw a mechanism in Post's home that could manufacture a postage stamp, thus obfuscating his whereabouts. Post was a former Air Force radar technician, also owned a pair of military-issued Air Force Wingwalker boots, similar to those that made prints leaving the scene of the crime at Lake Berryessa. Post had scars from a 1959 car crash that seemed to match the markings on the face of the police composite sketch based on the Presidio Heights teens' accounts and corroborated by Kathleen Johns. And while the tauntings continued throughout the 70s, Kleinsmith points out that the Zodiac killings stopped when Post got married. And if all that wasn't enough, Casebreakers founder Thomas J. Colbert claims to have 6 eyewitnesses, 3 of them via sworn affidavits, who say Post actually told them he was the Zodiac. For Casebreakers, though, the key was the cipher. The Zodiac's coded messages are infamous. The first was broken by a high school teacher and his wife. One was not solved until 2020, but some remain unsolved, baffling expert codebreakers from around the world. Allegedly, Dale was told that Post's full name is the key to breaking the cipher. He brought this up to the casebreakers, who consulted other code-breaking experts, and apparently it's a match. Using Post's name is the key to deciphering the letters. Any more details? Not quite. For one thing, no one can ask Post himself. He died in 2018. And in an interview with a YouTuber, Peter A. Turner, Kleinsmith admitted the lack of resources is holding up some verification. The hidden cache of weapons buried somewhere in the High Sierras? Kleinsmith says they don't have the skill, equipment, or legal permission to make that difficult hike and investigate, though they hope they can get organized soon. The ciphers? As with past attempts at breaking the Zodiac's codes, the FBI will have to verify. The DNA? There is some of Post available, apparently taken by police following an instance of domestic abuse later in his life. This will have to be officially verified by the FBI, which is a bit trickier. There is no confirmed Zodiac DNA at any of the crime scenes. The closest police have come is from the saliva on the stamps used to mail the Zodiac's mocking letters. So far, that partial profile has only been used to rule suspects out. The casebreakers are also concerned with linking the murder of Sherry Jo Bates to Post, and therefore the Zodiac. For decades, people have speculated that Bates was one of Zodiac's early victims. She was found stabbed to death on October 31, 1966, in Riverside, California. 10 feet from the body was a paint-splattered watch and a footprint made by a military-style boot. Bates had apparently fought her assailant, catching their skin and hair under her fingernails. Palm and fingerprints not belonging to her or any of her friends and family were also found inside her car. Later, letters boasting of the crime were sent to police, the press, and Bates's father. An anonymous letter sent to the San Francisco Chronicle's Paul Avery told the reporter to look into similarities between the Bates case and the Zodiac murders. Handwriting expert Sherwood Morrill believed the letter to Bates's father matched the Zodiac's letters, and the Zodiac killer even claimed Bates as one of his victims in a letter to the Los Angeles Times from 1971. The FBI officially considers Bates one of the Zodiac's victims. The Riverside police are more skeptical. As recently as August 2021, they revealed that the writer of the initial letters was known to them. The culprit made a confession anonymously in 2016. Police managed to track him down by, yes, DNA analysis from the saliva on the stamp used. Further investigation and further confession confirmed that the man wrote the letters in 1966 but was neither Bates's killer nor connected to the Zodiac murders. He had just been a troubled teen seeking attention. The department's official website hints that they have their own prime suspect unconnected to any of the Bay Area murders, and their investigation continues on that path. Zodiac or not, could there still be a connection between Post and Bates's murder? At the time of the murder, Post was no longer with the Air Force, but still received checkups and medical attention at the hospital on March Air Force Base. The base is just 10 miles from Riverside City College, where Bates's body was found, a 15-minute drive. Post was also a house painter for 40 years. Remember the paint-spattered watch found near the body? So far, the Riverside Police Department has declined the case-breakers' demand that they compare the DNA evidence from the Bates crime scene, still in storage, to Post's DNA. And there is no doubt DNA comparisons could help. It was DNA that finally shattered a favorite theory for Zodiac enthusiasts, Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was either interviewed or had his property searched by the police frequently over a period of 20 years. In 1969, he was questioned by the police when it was discovered that he was in the Lake Berryessa area the day of the Hartnell Shepard attacks. And a so-called friend of his, Don Chaney, approached the police in 1971. He claimed Allen told him that Allen wanted to kill people. Allen also owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch, a brand not really related to the murders except for the name and the symbol, the very same crosshairs that the killer used as his signature. He liked to be called by his middle name, Lee, and one of the victims, Darlene Farron, was said to have been friends with a mystery man named Lee. Besides, he was a known creep, with a record of sexual assaults and misconduct against young boys. Mike Majou, a survivor of one of the Zodiac attacks, identified Allen via photo lineup, albeit 23 years after the fact. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. But circumstantial evidence isn't definitive evidence. Some noted that Majou's assertion contradicted his initial eyewitness description of his attacker. Others pointed out that Allen was balder, rounder, taller, and 100 pounds heavier than any Zodiac description. His handwriting didn't match, nor did his palm print match anything collected at the crime scenes. Even Detective Dave Toschi, the lead investigator for the San Francisco Police Department, said, "Allen looked very, very good for a while, but everything's turned out to be negative." It wasn't until 2002 when DNA evidence from one of the Zodiac's letters would rule him out. Even Don Chaney's DNA was tested just to make sure. Nothing. Which is why some Zodiac experts are already meeting this Post news with some skepticism. They've all seen this before. So what if friends and family members say Post was the Zodiac? He's not the first to be accused by so-called loved ones. Allen, remember, was tipped to the cops by a friend. And even some of his relatives had their suspicions, but Allen wasn't the only one. In 2015, Gary Stewart researched his biological father, Earl Van Best. His search, he claims, revealed that after abandoning Gary in Baton Rouge in 1962, he moved on to California and became the Zodiac Killer. If you'd like to know more, you can read Stewart's book on the subject, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, or check out the original docuseries based on the book. In 2014, Randy Kenny told the press his friend Louis Myers confessed to the killings in April 2001. Myers would have been 17 at the time, and Kenny says the infamous Halloween card Paul Avery received in 1970 was the key to the whole thing. The inside says "for teen," not a kill count but a hint to look for a teen. Kenny claims that Myers went to school with some of his victims. Myers died in May 2002, but made Kenny swear that he would write and publish a book about Myers' allegations, with proceeds going to the victims' families, of course. In 2009, Deborah Perez of Corona, California claimed her father, Guy Ward Hendrickson, was the Zodiac Killer. She went further, actually saying that when she was 7 years old, he had her write the letters, lick the stamps, and sew the mask he wore. She also happened to be working on a documentary on the subject. Her half-sister claims it's all lies. In 2006, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel released his best-selling book, The Black Dahlia Avenger. The book made a convincing case that his father, George Hodel, killed Elizabeth Short, another legendary cold case victim who was murdered and mutilated in Los Angeles in 1947. As we said, it was a bestseller, praised by critics and police. Less praised was his 2009 follow-up where he claimed his father was also the Zodiac Killer, and Chicago Lipstick Killer of 1945 and the Manila Jigsaw Murderer in 1967. So yes, while some are greeting the news of Post's identification with a sigh of "finally," others look at the news with crossed arms and an arched brow. After all, the founder of Casebreakers, Thomas Colbert, used to work in production in Hollywood. In one interview, Eric Kleinsmith made sure to plug the team's upcoming docuseries about their investigation of the D.B. Cooper case, coming to a prestige streaming service. And their press release emphasizes twice that the guy who broke the case for them, Dale Julian, has written a quote, copyrighted book manuscript on the subject. Two masked men wheel a tea chest down a dark cobblestone street in the city of Edinburgh, Scotland. Inside the chest is the body of a dead man. The corpse is fresh, which means the two guys will get a tidy sum of cash for it. The man who hands them the money is a renowned anatomist at a leading medical training school. He knows what he's doing isn't exactly ethical, but in the name of medical science, he's prepared to bend a few rules. What he doesn't know is the two guys aren't merely body snatchers, they're cold-hearted killers. Before we come back to those two fiends, let us first explain to you why a globally recognized scientist would be buying dead bodies from criminals. In Britain in the 18th century, people could be executed for what might now seem like petty trivial things. For example, under the Waltham Black Act of 1723, a person who was found to have purposefully blackened their face could be sentenced to death. That's because the government thought poaching was becoming a big problem, and the poachers sometimes tried to evade being spotted by putting black stuff on their faces. After these new laws were introduced, a person could also be executed for fishing, destroying a fish pond or some trees, and even setting fire to some hay. These kinds of tough-on-crime measures became known as part of the Bloody Code, and by the time the 19th century rolled around, a person could be put to death for a whopping 220 different offenses, including petty theft if the value of the goods was high enough. With the Murder Act of 1752 introduced, there were quite a few executions every year. What this law meant was that someone convicted of murder could be sentenced to death, and also what was called punitive dissection, meaning their bodies could by law be opened up after death by medical experts who worked in the growing discipline of anatomy. According to historians, once that person had been hanged, medical students would stand around at the bottom of the gallows arguing over who had the right to take the body. Bodies were in huge demand, but even with the strict laws, there just weren't enough of them. The problem was made worse in the 19th century because fewer people were being handed the death sentence. This was mostly a result of the Death Act of 1823, which made it so judges could pass lesser sentences than death for various crimes. It didn't bode well for the anatomists, who even though they were making breakthroughs in surgery, didn't have enough bodies to work on. The government wasn't serving up enough quality cadavers, and that led to some enterprising people stealing bodies. These people were known as resurrectionists or body snatchers. In the middle of the night, they'd turn up at graveyards to dig up the recently deceased. They'd then deliver the body to the medical school and collect their payment. The public didn't like knowing their deceased loved one might be taken and subsequently cut to pieces on a cold slab, so they did what they could to protect the grave. That meant sometimes hiring guards for the burial site if they had the money to do so, or for less cash hiring a huge slab that could be placed over the grave until the body was decomposed enough to not be of any use to the anatomists. The size of this problem can't be understated. One body snatching outfit alone, known as the London Burkers, admitted in 1831 to robbing and selling in the region of 1,000 bodies. The money was good too, with the corpse generally fetching around 10 pounds once delivered to the medical school. Looking at currency calculators, that meant a body was worth about 1,000 pounds in today's money. That's about $1,400. The price for a body sometimes depended on the season. Bodies in winter paid more because they were generally less decomposed. There were enough people willing to take the risk of stealing bodies with that amount of money involved, and there was always enough anatomists willing to turn a blind eye to crime. But with the public getting so good at protecting grave sites, a crisis occurred. That crisis was felt in the city of Edinburgh, which was one of the most pioneering places on the planet when it came to the study of anatomy. One of the leading anatomists was Robert Knox, a man who regularly wooed hundreds of medical students when he lectured on anatomy at the Royal College of Surgeons. Almost every day he dissected bodies in front of a crowd of students, and that work led to some amount of fame as well as progress in the field of anatomy. As we said though, there just weren't enough corpses for this groundbreaking work, and that's how Knox got to know two guys named William Burke and William Hare. These were two industrious young lads who both came from the tough streets of Ireland and later moved to Scotland. They would also become known as serial killers. There's a little rhyme that Scottish people would sometimes recite after the two were caught. Up the close and doon the stair, button ben with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef. They became friends in 1827 after Burke had moved into the lodging house that Hare owned with his lover, Margaret Laird, also known as Margaret Hare, even though they weren't legally married. It's likely the two men had previously met while working on the Union Canal. They drank a lot, and they got a bit of a reputation for being wayward. This is how one historian described Hare: illiterate and uncouth, a lean, quarrelsome, violent, and amoral character with the scars from old wounds about his head and brow. That same year they both met, an army pensioner named Donald died in the lodging house. It was a bad time to go, for Hare at least. Donald owed him quite a bit of back rent, so over a bottle of whiskey, Burke and Hare discussed the possibility of selling Donald's body to the medical school. They then bought a coffin and filled it with bark, after which it was taken to the graveyard for burial. They took the body to Edinburgh University, where they had heard they'd be able to find a buyer. At first they asked for Alexander Monroe, someone who was said to be the rival of Mr. Knox, although history tells us he wasn't half as talented. It was a student that told the guys to head over to Surgeon's Square where they'd find Knox. They did just that, and they were paid £7 10 shillings for the corpse. Hare took a little bit more of the bounty to cover what he'd lost on the dead man's rent. On the way out, one of Knox's assistants said, "We'd be glad to see you again when you have another to dispose of." This was some windfall for the two guys, and they knew there and then that they could make a lot more money. All they needed was bodies, but as you know, graves were already very hard to rob since families had started taking security seriously. They got their chance to supply Knox with another body when a man staying at the lodging house became ill. His name was Joseph, and while he wasn't deathly ill, he soon looked that way after Hare and Burke plied him with enough whiskey to make an elephant stumble. They then suffocated the poor drunken man by holding a pillow over his nose and mouth. Their method of killing worked out well for them because it looked as though the deceased might have passed away from natural causes. Since the man had already been somewhat sick, his death didn't raise any suspicions. In fact, experts later wrote that the murder would have been practically undetectable. They received £10 for the corpse. This is how the pair would kill other people, a method that would end up coming to be known as burking. That's how the guys in England got the name London Burkers, because they robbed graves and also murdered people. Historians don't agree about who died next at the hands of Hare and Burke. It could have been an elderly woman named Abigail Simpson, or it could have been a guy from England who was up in Scotland selling matches when he got a case of jaundice. It seems again the pair took advantage of the sick man and they saw an opportunity. Burke lay on the man's body while Hare suffocated him, this time with his hands. Yet again, the guys turned up where Knox worked and collected their cash. As for Simpson, she being elderly was easy prey. She was a frail pensioner who was in Edinburgh trying to raise some cash by selling salt. On February 12, 1828, she made the fatal mistake of agreeing to go back to the lodging house with the pair, after which they plied her with copious amounts of whiskey. She was subsequently burked. They then hid the body in a tea chest and took it to Knox, who it seems was very happy about its fresh state. Burke would later say Dr. Knox approved of it being so fresh, but he did not ask any questions. This was the thing with some doctors, they turned a blind eye to people breaking the law in the name of medical science, although it should be noted that Knox had no idea he was collecting murdered people. Soon after the murder of Simpson, Margaret Hare lured another woman into the house and gave her non-stop glasses of whiskey, after which Mr. Hare came home and killed her as she was passed out. That was another £10 in the bank. Just weeks later, Burke was out in the city when he met two women by the names of Mary Patterson and Janet Brown. They drank heavily in the tavern and then went back to Burke's brother's house for more whiskey. Burke's wife then turned up and a fight broke out after she accused him of having intimate relations with Brown. At this point, Patterson was passed out drunk. Brown left soon after. Burke's wife left and went to get Hare, who turned up at the house with Margaret. The two men then locked their wives in one room and killed Patterson in another room. They took her body straight to Knox, which prompted one of Knox's assistants to ask how they'd gotten hold of a corpse that was still warm. The two men said they'd bought it from an old woman and that the deceased had drunk herself to death, which seemed believable given the smell of whiskey that emanated from her. Knox didn't mind. It was said that he was over the moon about getting such an excellent cadaver. He stored it in a vat of whiskey and dissected it 3 months later. The next victim was an old woman named Mrs. Haldane. Yet again, she was plied with whiskey and the deed was done when she was barely conscious. Believe it or not, that woman's daughter later stayed at the lodgings and she was also murdered and then sold for £10. A woman named Effie was next. She was something of a scavenger and knew Burke from selling him bits of old leather she'd found in people's trash. Not too long after, she was dead and on Knox's slab. Burke was walking in the street when he saw a policeman trying to help a drunk woman who couldn't walk right. Burke kindly offered to help, telling the cop he'd take care of her. He did, but in the way he'd taken care of other women. The next murders were unique in that they were a double slaying. They killed a grandmother and her grandson while they were staying at the lodging house. They killed the woman in an upstairs bedroom and then they went down for the boy. Burke later said he always felt haunted by the expression on the boy's face just before they killed him. The two people couldn't fit in the tea chest, so this time they used a herring barrel to take the bodies to Surgeon's Square. That was too big for the horse, which refused to move. They managed to flag down a cart and hitch a ride with that, but the poor horse was later shot by Hare. Knox paid paid them £8 for each corpse. As often happens in criminal enterprises, the two men later fell out. Burke had been out of town for a while, and when he returned, he discovered Hare looking like he'd just come into money. Burke accused Hare of selling bodies behind his back, which Hare denied. A quick trip to see Dr. Knox proved to Burke that Hare had indeed done a bit of moonlighting, and the two got into a fistfight. Burke moved out of the lodging house after that, but the two men soon made up and started killing again. On a trip to visit Burke at his house, the two had some drinks when the washerwoman Miss Ostler turned up. The men gave each other a knowing look and proceeded to murder her. She was sold for £8. Not long after, Burke's wife's relative, Anne Dougal, came to stay. It wasn't the best of trips for her. She was worth £10. The next victim was much more a handful. He was an 18-year-old boy named James Wilson who had deformed feet and some mental issues. He lived on the streets and begged and was fondly known to people as Daft Jamie. Hare and Burke met Jamie on the street and told him there was free food and whiskey back at the lodging house. This kid was strong and he could handle his booze. Plus, he preferred snuff to the drink. Hare and Burke did eventually manage to kill the boy, but not without incurring some cuts and bruises. Thing was, Jamie was well known in the city. When the men delivered the body, Knox gladly paid them the cash, but some of the students said they knew the kid and he was alive and well not long ago. Seeing a threat on the horizon, Knox cut off his head and feet. He then dissected the body, even though he had others on the list to do before him. Knox was acting like a guilty man, but he wasn't going to give up paying those very reliable men. Burke then met a woman named Margaret Docherty. Since he was born and raised in Ireland, he used this to get on the good side of Mrs. Docherty, who was also from Ireland. It didn't take long for him to convince her to go to his place for some drinks. Hare also came around, as did the two wives, and merriment ensued over hours of many drinks. That was the downfall of Mrs. Docherty. They killed her and hid the body in some straw. That worked out badly for the killers because the next day some lodgers also stayed at the house and discovered the body of Docherty and noticed that she had been beaten up. They went straight to the cops, but by the time they arrived at the house, Hare and Burke had already sold the body to Knox. Still, the police found blood-stained sheets at the house. Then they went to Knox's place and found Docherty's body on a dissection table. The lodgers confirmed that it was her they found at the house. Burke and Hare were subsequently brought in for questioning, as were their wives. They all told different stories as to what happened, but in the end, the men were charged with murder. As for Knox, it was ruled that he hadn't broken the law per se by buying the bodies, but he was accused of being deficient in principle and heart. The gravity of the crime soon became more apparent, especially after Hare turned King's evidence. That meant becoming a witness for the state so that at least one man could be convicted of the murders. Hare turned on his partner and left Burke and his wife to face the music. On Christmas Day 1828, the judge sentenced Burke to death. His final statement, the judge said these now historic lines: "Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." Prior to his death, Burke confessed to the full extent of the crime, saying he always felt bad about what he'd done and could only sleep with the aid of alcohol and opium. He also said Hare was the one who had the murderousness in him. Nonetheless, Burke was detested and angry mobs made their feelings known, at some points chasing down the two wives who were never convicted of the murders. 25,000 people turned up on January 28, 1829 when Burke was hanged. The tickets for the subsequent public dissection by Professor Monroe sold out in seconds, and a riot ensued when some students couldn't get through the door. Today, you can actually see Burke's death mask and skeleton at the Anatomy Museum of Edinburgh Medical School. Hare was kept in custody for some time to protect him from the mob. There was a real threat of being beaten to death. His wife had been badly beaten while trying to get over to Ireland. Mr. Hare was snuck out of Edinburgh on a coach, but he was recognized on the way by another passenger. He was soon hunted down by a mob and so was taken to a local prison for protection. There, the crowd swarmed in numbers, trying to knock down doors and throwing stones at the windows. The crowd was eventually dispersed by police, and in the middle of the night, Hare was taken from his cell and driven by coach in the direction of the English border. When he was close, he was told to make his own way to England. He was never seen again, or at least there are no records of sightings. As for Knox, he might have gotten away with it in the eyes of the law, but the mobs let their anger be known when they turned up at his house. He was later disbarred from the Royal College of Surgeons, although to this day he's credited with being one of the main people that advanced the study of anatomy. Still, back then the public for the most part was furious that men of science were involved with grave robbing. A bill called the Anatomy Act of 1832 was introduced, which made it legal for people to donate bodies to the advancement of science. The schools also said if a donation is received, they'll foot the bill for the funeral. This put an end to the work of the resurrectionists, but it hardly impressed the public, who didn't like the idea of dissection at all, nor the fact that it was usually only paupers who ended up on the slab. One activist wrote at the time, "They tell us it was necessary for science. Science? Why? Who is science for? Not for poor people. Then if it's necessary for science, let them have the bodies of the rich, for whose benefit benefit science is cultivated. 78-year-old Samuel Little sits across a table from a Texas Ranger matter-of-factly describing how he took the lives of many of his victims. He's frail, wheelchair-bound, and has heart disease and diabetes. With armed guards around him, he talks about how he got away with over 90 murders in 19 states over a period of decades. He doesn't seem to have a care in the world, which is why he's been described as pure evil. From 1970 to 2005, this man traveled from state to state, covering much of the U.S. in search of vulnerable women that would satisfy his deranged needs. In 1971, in Kendall, Florida, there was a Sarah or Donna. He describes this Jane Doe perfectly and then sketches her face for investigators. He does the same for a 25-year-old woman he says he met outside a strip club in 1984 when driving to Cincinnati. Slight of frame, short blonde hair, blue eyes, and with a look of what he calls a hippie. Her fate was sealed when she got in the car. These confessions, with their detailed descriptions, and it has to be said, fairly accomplished sketches, not only surprised investigators but rocked the USA. The authorities knew very well that Little wasn't making it up. Not all his confessions have been confirmed, but enough of them have for the FBI to announce that Mr. Little is the most prolific serial killer in US history. Before we get into some of those cases and how on earth he got away with his crimes, what do we know about Samuel Little, the child? We know he was born on June 7, 1940 in the small town of Reynolds, Georgia. This is a place that right now only has a population of just over 1,000, with almost a quarter of these people living below the poverty line. According to Little, he wasn't exactly born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Describing his mother's job of being a lady of the night, it's thought he was born in prison after his teenage mother had been arrested for plying what some people have called the oldest trade in the world. At one point, she gave up trying to look after her son and ditched him on the side of the road. That's a reason why, when growing up, Little spent a good deal of his time living with his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. He attended Hawthorne Junior High School in Ohio, but it seems his grades were poor and behavior even poorer. He soon dropped out and set in motion what would become a lifetime of crime. At age 16 in 1956, he was convicted of the crime of breaking and entering and spent some time in a juvenile detention center. 5 years later, he was sent to adult prison after being arrested for breaking into a Lorain furniture store. For the rest of his free life, he moved from state to state, occasionally holding down jobs, but always committing crimes. It's believed that before the man hit 35 years old, he was arrested at least 26 times in 11 states. Those crimes included assault, theft, fraud, DUI, breaking and entering, solicitation, armed robbery, shoplifting, aggravated assault on a police officer, and more. Little did the police know, though, by this time he'd already started killing. By that time, the mid-70s rolled around. Stealing through the day and going out looking for women at night was how he spent many of his days. Those women were almost always African Americans living on the fringes of society. They were women who worked as prostitutes, or were addicted to drugs, or were homeless and living in shelters, or all of those things. Little once commented, "They was broke and homeless, and they walked right into my spiderweb." His modus operandi didn't often change in that he went to the places where the most vulnerable people could be found, and then he befriended women. Sometimes he'd offer them a ride in his car, sometimes he'd ask to go for a drink with them, at other times he tempted them with the promise of drugs. Once they'd gotten into his car, they had a little chance of surviving. This was a strong man, a muscular man who'd fought as a light heavyweight boxer. He'd often knock his victims clean out before strangling them, an act which gratified his perverse desires. Sometimes he'd stroke their necks, feigning intimacy, kindness, and then his powerful hands would tighten around him. His crimes shouldn't have gone on for as long as they did, but as you'll find out later, his choice of a victim was very likely the reason why he could do what he did and get away with it. He almost came unstuck at the start, though. On September 11, 1976, a woman named Pamela K. Smith was found half naked, her hands tied behind her with electrical cord. Pounding on a stranger's house door, she screamed and shouted until someone came to help her. This woman, a drug addict, said Little had picked her up in the city of St. Louis. They'd driven around for a while and then parked in a quiet area. Little attacked her. She managed to escape, and soon the cops found Little still in his car. He denied any kind of sexual motive for the attack and said, in his own words, "I only beat her." For that crime, he spent just 3 months in the county jail. Had the woman not escaped, that could have been a murder. Had she not been in trouble with the law in the past for her heroin addiction and failing to turn up in court on occasions, Little might have been scrutinized a little more. In 1982, a mentally disabled woman named Patricia Ann Mount was found in Forest Grove, Florida. This woman, who had an IQ of just 40, was last seen dancing with a man in a tavern. That man was Samuel Little. He was acquitted of the crime, with a defense attorney stating there's more doubt than there is fact. Many years later, Little would let the authorities know that he indeed had committed that murder. She wasn't his only victim in Florida either. Then there was Melinda Rose Lapre. Her body was found in 1982 in Pascagoula, Mississippi. She'd been dead a long time, so the body was in a state of advanced decomposition, which didn't help investigators. The night she went missing, she'd been working as a prostitute. When she left the streets in a station wagon, other women on the street saw the man who was driving the car. They gave a description of him to the police, and so when 6 weeks later Little was picked up in a traffic stop, he was taken in for questioning. Not only did one of those women pick out his image in a photo lineup, but another woman came forward and said the same man had assaulted her in the past. The problem was, prosecutors said there was no physical evidence to link Little with the murder. They said a positive ID wasn't enough to take the case to trial, so Little was allowed to go. An even worse blemish on the justice system is the fact that the district attorney's office said it wasn't happy about prosecuting a man when the only witnesses were prostitutes. Investigator Darren Versiga later said that the police back then were hesitant to believe assault claims from black prostitutes. Such discrimination is of course sad and patently unethical, but it's not that unusual, and certainly wasn't so unusual in the past. You'll see there's a term in the world of crime called the less dead people. These are the folks that serial killers often prey on. They're the poorest, most disenfranchised citizens, folks who can go missing and no one even reports it. Sometimes they end up as Jane or John Does, even if the police do have an ID. Due to their low socioeconomic status, and in some cases their rap sheet, they might not exactly drum up a lot of sympathy from the public or be the most pressing cases for homicide detectives. They were seen as less alive, less valued before they died, and so when they did die, they became less dead, even though you'd think they'd elicit the most sympathy given their difficult circumstances. This is how one person described how law enforcement sometimes treats the less dead. A great deal less pressure is felt by the police when victims of crime come from the marginal elements. Samuel Little knew what he was doing by targeting society's most vulnerable. He talked about it once in an interview, saying, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists, nothing like that. I kill a journalist, it'd be all over the news the next day. I stayed in the ghettos." The FBI has since said that many of his victims didn't look as though they'd been murdered. Since he punched and strangled the women, police often thought the cause of death was a drug overdose or an accident or death from natural causes. Still, others have written that police didn't look hard enough, and that's because the lives the women had led. Perhaps rather than rigorously scrutinize the cause of death, a death of a woman with a history of petty crime or drug use was sometimes overlooked. If you look at Little's many victims, almost every single one of them fits into the less dead category. We'll get around to them soon, but first let's see how Little was caught. In 1984, he was arrested in San Diego. He kidnapped one prostitute and left her for dead on a dirt road. And then a month after that, he was found on that same dirt road with an unconscious woman in his car. Both women had been hit hard and then choked, but both of them survived the ordeal. A jury couldn't reach a verdict, and Little in the end pled guilty to the crimes of false imprisonment and assault with great bodily injury. He was out after only 2.5 years, then moved to Los Angeles. During this time in the City of Angels, it's thought he killed at least another 10 women, and at one point was arrested for possession of cocaine. He never turned up in court and then fled LA. He moved around yet again and had many brushes with the law, although because the warrant for his drug possession charge was non-extraditable, he was never sent back to LA to face the charges. It wasn't until September 5, 2012, when he was staying at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, that his web of crime started to become untangled. An LAPD detective named Mitzi Roberts had been working on murder cases, and she found that Little's DNA could be connected to 2 murders. He eventually was extradited to California on a narcotics charge, and it's there that DNA testing linked him with a 3rd murder. Shortly after this, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was in contact with police from Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Los Angeles detectives were talking to these people too, and it soon became apparent that this is the guy that could have killed the women from one coast of the US to the other. He was charged in 2013 for the murders of 3 women in LA. One had been found in a dumpster, another in a garage, and the 3rd down an alleyway. All 3 had been strangled. For those brutal crimes, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, all the time maintaining that he was an innocent man. It wasn't until 2018 when Little started dropping confession bombs. He was 78 and on the verge of death, and it's then that he started talking to law enforcement from various US states. These confessions solved the cases of many deaths police had deemed suspicious, as well as unsolved murders. Little had a good memory when it came to faces and how he'd killed each victim, although he wasn't always good with dates. What was surprising was the fact that he was able to accurately sketch many of the people he'd murdered. While cops might have suspected him to be behind a lot of murders, they weren't prepared for what he told them. They were in fact interviewing the most prolific serial killer in American history. There's such a thing as serial killers that have claimed to have killed many more people than they are convicted of killing. It said serial killer Gary Ridgway might have killed many more than the 49 people he was convicted of killing, but that's not been proven. Richard Cottingham, aka the Butcher of Times Square, claimed to have killed 85 to 100 people during his 13 years hunting down women, but it remains to be seen if that's true. As for Little, it's now thought that he killed 93 people, but the FBI has said for now they can only confirm that he killed 60 women. It's likely he killed his first person back in 1970. The FBI had said this about Little's confession. He remembers where he was and what car he was driving. He draws pictures of many of the women he killed. It's very likely he did kill 93 women, given his honesty about the other murders and the details he could recall, although corroborating his stories is still a work in progress. We'll give you some examples of what he told the FBI. The reason the FBI has put these examples on its website is so someone might be able to help them with their investigation. Maybe some of our viewers could be of help after hearing this. Little said sometime between 1992 and 1994 he met an African-American woman in an area of Little Rock, Arkansas. He said it was a cold night and that it might have been snowing. The two went shoplifting together and Little was arrested for that. Police records corroborate the story. He got out of jail and went to move his car, which he said was a Cadillac Eldorado or a yellow Dodge. His accomplice was sleeping in the car. The next day, after driving down an old dirt road, he stopped the car and committed the murder. He told police that he dumped the body near a cornfield. The problem is, Little couldn't remember her full name. He said he thought her first name was Ruth, but he wasn't sure. He was also able to sketch her face. Then there was the African-American woman who he said he met in 1982 in New Orleans. He described her as being 30 to 40 years old, 5'8" to 5'9" inches tall, and weighing in the region of 160 pounds. He said her skin was honey-colored brown and her hair was medium length. She was in a club celebrating someone's birthday when they met. Little and the woman left the club in a Lincoln Continental Mark III. She told him that she lived with her mom and that her mom was either very sick or an invalid since the woman had to look after her. Together, they drove toward an area called Little Woods and took the exit off I-10. He said he drove down a dirt road where the canal was being dredged. He killed her and left her body next to the canal. He drew a picture of her, too. It was 1971 or 1972 when he met another one of his victims, this time in Miami, Florida. He said she was an 18 to 19-year-old African-American transgender person named Marianne or Marion. She was 5'6" to 5'7" inches tall and weighed around 140 pounds. The two met at a place called the Pool or Pool Palace, which Little said was on 17th Avenue in Miami. It wasn't until a few days later that they met again. This time the location was the historic Overton neighborhood. During these meetings, he said he learned that she lived with a bunch of roommates in either Brownsville or Liberty City. Little said he turned up at that house and one of the roommates asked him to go out and buy some shaving cream. He agreed and set off in his gold four-door Pontiac Le Mans. Except he had no intention of buying the cream. Instead, he and Marianne headed north on Highway 27. He said he stopped the car close to the sugarcane field and killed her there in someone's driveway. He then continued down Highway 27 until he reached the Everglades. He turned down a dirt road until he arrived at the river or a swamp. He dragged the body through the mud and the water and left the scene. These are just a few of the unmatched confessions. Others have been matched and murders have been solved. Although in some cases the bodies were never identified, so they're still Jane Doe's. It's uncertain how much guilt Little felt for what he'd done. Sometimes he smiled a lot while being interviewed. There was certainly no trace of remorse or shame in his voice or his face. He also once said he didn't fear God for what he'd done. "I live in my mind now with my babies and my drawings," he said in one interview. By his babies, he was perversely referring to the women he'd heartlessly murdered. He also said in that interview, "The only things I was ever good at was drawing and fighting." In fact, that's how he sometimes lured women, telling them that they were beautiful and then promising to employ his formidable artistic skills to draw them. He did just that to the victim in Odessa, Texas. He kept his promise, but she was already dead when he sketched her. Little died on December 30th, 2020. The cause of death wasn't reported in the media, although he was a sick man. It's the dead of night on the mean streets of London's impoverished East End. On one particular street, a man's horse suddenly rears up while pulling a cart. Something's frightened it. The guy then lights a match and makes a grisly discovery: the body of a woman with her throat sliced from ear to ear. What this man doesn't know is Jack the Ripper is hiding right next to him in the shadows. If he pricked his ears, he'd probably hear the Ripper's labored breathing. a consequence of just cutting that poor woman's neck. The Ripper should have been seen that night. He should have been caught. In fact, as you'll see in this show, it's frankly incomprehensible that he wasn't stopped in his tracks there and then. That man's name was Louis Diemschutz. We're going to come back to him and explain just how close he was to catching the Ripper. But first, let's give you a small introduction to possibly the world's most famous serial killer. One of the reasons it was difficult to catch the man was the fact that those London streets in the 1880s were a giant labyrinth that were hardly well lit. Some of the slum areas were ripe for murder at night. Seeing that prostitutes wandered around by themselves in the dark looking for gin-addicted clients. The area of Whitechapel, where the Ripper committed his ghastly crimes, was heaving in those days with people living in abject poverty. When folks couldn't get any work, some of them turned to crime. Many of the women turned to what's sometimes called the oldest trade in the world. In fact, in 1880, there were a total of 62 brothels and 1,200 prostitutes in this area alone. Some of these women lived in the lodging houses. These were about the cheapest places you could live. Some of the rooms even had a rope you could lean on as a form of bed. This was where we get the term hangover, because people would literally hang over a rope. The rope cost 2 pence a night, and while uncomfortable, it was better than the street and all the dangers that lurked there. This was a kind of place where Jack the Ripper made his name. It was a cauldron of violence, vice, racism, and some say immorality. In other words, it was an ideal place to kill people because the police can sometimes be less than caring about the victims of this so-called lower class. But once the Ripper got going, he was hard to ignore. That was because of the extreme nature of his crimes. It's thought he killed 5 people for sure, called the canonical 5, but he might have murdered as many as 11. For instance, no one's certain if he killed Emma Elizabeth Smith. She'd fallen on hard times and became a prostitute, with a detective later writing about her. There was something about Emma Smith which suggested that there had been a time when the comforts of life had not been denied to her. There was a touch of culture in her speech, unusual in her class. In the wee hours of April 3, 1888, she was savagely attacked. She didn't die instantly but went into a coma and died shortly after. Was this the work of the Ripper? It's hard to know. She wasn't mutilated like many of the later victims, but her injuries were horrifying nonetheless. Then there was Martha Tabram, an alcoholic who had a reputation for staying out all night and causing general havoc. On August 6, 1888, she and some other women went to the Angel and Crown pub and, as the expression goes, got hammered. She was later found dead, again with horrifying injuries. Those included being stabbed in her heart and lungs. The killer also stabbed her 9 times in the throat. The term overkill was suitable here, with 39 stab wounds on her body in total. Detective Edmund Reed was on the case. A mysterious man had been seen that night close to where the victim was found, so he put a bunch of men in the lineup. Nothing came of it. There's a slim chance it could have been the work of the Ripper, and if it was, he was close to being caught that night, although he came a hell of a lot closer, as you'll soon see. One of the reasons this woman is said to have been the victim of possibly a different killer is the fact that she wasn't skillfully mutilated, and she hadn't been eviscerated. The murder weapon used to kill her was also cruder than the one the Ripper used. Now we come to the first victim who is included in the canonical 5. She was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to her friends. She was killed August 31st that same year. Yeah, that is a short time after the last murder, but as we said, those London slums were terrible places to live back then, so it's possible there were a few men who killed women in the East End in those months. The MOs might have been similar to the murders, but the Ripper had quite a unique signature. That's why you're watching the video about him right now. It was his method of killing that made headlines all over the world, not just the fact that he killed. Killers were two a penny, but skilled mutilators were not. Polly also had a tough life, at times getting money from rent, by working in one of London's brutal workhouses, and other times by selling her body. On the night of August 30th, she went to the Frying Pan pub and had some drinks. It seems she might have spent all her cash, because later she was chucked out of her lodging house for not being able to pay the rent. She looked at the landlord that night and said, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." Maybe she thought her new bonnet would help her find a client or two, and so she'd have a bed that night. Early in the morning, she was seen staggering around drunk as hell. Slurring her words, she said to an acquaintance, "I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I've spent it." Those were the last words anyone ever heard from Polly. Charles Allen Cross was the man that found her body at 3:40 a.m. What's amazing is that when Cross found her, she'd likely only been dead for about 10 minutes. The Ripper couldn't have gotten far in that time. In fact, cops interrogated 3 horse slaughterers. They were Harry Tompkins, James Munford, and Charles Britton. They'd been close to the scene of the crime when it happened. As we said, the killer had to be nearby. Someone had to have seen something. The cops were also taken aback by the sheer brutality of the murder. The woman had not only had her throat cut, but her abdomen had been mutilated, so much so her insides were spilling out. A 6 to 8 inch knife had been used, possibly a shoemaker's knife, and it seemed to medical experts that some anatomical skill had been employed in the murder. There were so many injuries to Polly that the police determined that the killer must have been working on her for a full 5 minutes, and this was out in the open. Also, on his escape, the killer would have had some blood on him. Was this man invisible or something? Surely someone had to have seen something. Upon investigation, this is what the coroner had to say about that. It seems astonishing, at first thought, that the culprit should have escaped detection, for there must surely have been marks of blood about this person. Still, he said that with there being so many slaughterhouses in the area, a man had been walking around with blood-stained clothes, maybe onlookers would have thought nothing of it. Now, there had been 3 brutal murders, although police couldn't say if they'd been committed by the same person. It was at this time that London's infamous press got to work, which fomented chaos in the city. Nowhere seemed safe. Then on September 8th, there was the grisly discovery of Annie Chapman. Her life was also a tale of woe. She had a problem with booze, which worsened after her daughter died, and she had to place her disabled son in care. Then her husband split with her and took the last child, and she ended up living in one of those run-down Whitechapel lodging houses. After her husband died from his alcoholism, the little bit of cash he sent her was gone. She made money by doing odd jobs after that, but also prostituted herself when things got desperate. At 5:15 a.m. that morning, a man heard a woman scream when he was walking along Hanbury Street. He didn't bother to investigate, and so yet again, the Ripper could have been caught if things had been a little different. She was found at 6 a.m. nearby and hadn't been dead long. This is what one of the doctors said in his report. The instrument used at the throat and abdomen was the same. It must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade, and must have been at least 6 to 8 inches in length, probably longer. The injuries could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes. Those injuries matched the ones on Polly, with experts saying the killer must have had some anatomical knowledge due to the fact that in one movement, he'd taken out her reproductive organs. The press went crazy, making up stories that some guy nicknamed Leather Apron might have been to blame. One report said, "Whatever information may be in the possession of the police, they deem it necessary to keep secret." It's believed their attention is particularly directed to a notorious character known as Leather Apron. A man named John Pizer was arrested and interrogated. He was known as Leather Apron, and he had a history of violence, but in the end, he proved his innocence and even claimed some compensation from the newspapers that named and shamed him. It might not have been him, but whoever it was had committed the crime in a fairly busy area. Yet again, it seemed the culprit had a mask of invisibility, but in the next murder, he might have basically done the deed right under someone's nose. Louis Dimeschutz had spent the day of September 29th selling his cheap jewelry. At the end of the day, feeling tired, he took his horse and cart back to Dutsfield Yard. Little did he know that as he approached the yard, the Ripper was mutilating a woman named Elizabeth Stride. Again, her life was full of tragedy, a story including dying children and a dead husband. Her misfortune led to her working as a prostitute, or at least on the days she couldn't afford to pay for her room in the slum. Stride had been spotted about 11 p.m. that night with a man wearing a bowler hat. He was also said to have been well-dressed and sported a rather fetching black mustache. We may never know if he was the Ripper. At around 12:45 a.m., she was seen again with a man who was well-dressed. This was just after a policeman had seen her with a man wearing a hat, although he didn't describe it as being a bowler hat. Whoever the man was, Stride had apparently said to him, "No, not tonight, some other night." Just before 1 a.m., she was seen by at least 2 other people, and both times she was with the man. The Ripper was certainly a brazen killer, knowing he'd been seen with Stride, but he still carried the act through to its bloody end. It was at 1 a.m. when Dimeschutz's horse could be heard clip-clopping down the street. He later explained, "I left home about 11:30 in the morning and returned home at exactly 1 a.m. Sunday morning. I noticed the time at the tobacco shop in the commercial road. I was driving a pony harnessed to a costermonger's barrow. It was as he entered the yard that his pony stopped in its tracks, as if startled by something. Dimeschutz thought he could see something in the way, but with it being so dark, he had no idea what it was. That's when he pulled out some matches. Now, with the glow of the match, he pulled out his whip and nudged whatever it was on the floor. It was then that he realized it was a body, and noticing a dress, he knew it was a woman. What he didn't know was that she'd only just been killed. He actually thought at one point the body might be his wife. This was the East End. Coming across a passed-out person in the street who'd had one too many drinks was not unusual at all. Dimeschutz said so much in his statement, which read in part, "I took no further notice of it, but went into the club and asked where my missus was. I found her in the front room on the ground floor. I left the pony in the yard by itself just outside the club door. My wife was with several of the members of the club. I told them, there's a woman lying in the yard, but I cannot say whether she is drunk or dead." He subsequently left the scene, got himself a candle, and then returned to the body. It was then that he noticed all the blood. He then ran through the streets looking for a policeman, but unable to find one, he returned to the body with another man. Not one to understand much about contaminating a crime scene, he lifted up the woman's body. He saw that her throat had been cut from ear to ear. The actual autopsy report stated that Stride had not long before her death consumed some cheese and potatoes. It also said there was a clear-cut incision on the neck. It was 6 inches in length and commenced 2.5 inches in a straight line below the angle of the jaw, 3/4 of an inch over an undivided muscle, and then becoming deeper, dividing the sheath. The cut was very clean and deviated a little downwards. The arteries and other vessels contained in the sheath were all cut through. This time, though, he didn't remove any organs. Maybe he didn't have time. Several families lived in the area. Then even more people came forward and said they'd seen Stride either talking or arguing with a man. Another person said the man had a mustache. Not only that, but the International Working Men's Educational Club, where Dime Shoots was a steward, was full of people singing and dancing. This place was right next to where the murder had taken place. Had they not been singing, people would have surely heard Stride's screams through a window that was open. That's debatable though, seeing as the Ripper might have made his cut before she had a chance to scream. If he did commit this murder, he surely had a busy night. That's because about 45 minutes later, not too far away, he killed Catherine Eddowes. She had been slashed over the face and had her throat cut. The autopsy report said the peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side and the left kidney carefully taken out and removed. I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them. Still, it's long been disputed if such work required the skill of a surgeon. Some thought no, but the killer might have worked as a butcher. It was certain that all those mutilations might have taken around 5 minutes. Another doctor testified that when he arrived at the scene, she'd only been dead for about 40 minutes. It should be said in those days that was a lot of guesswork as compared to now, but still, doctors had a fairly good idea about the time of death in such cases. So the Ripper had committed 2 murders in a short space of time. He might have rushed the first one, seeing that he basically did it right under people's noses. Even with the second one, he could easily have been seen. That's when the killer really started to push his luck. He either began a correspondence with the police and press, or someone was playing a hoax. After these murders, a postcard was sent to the cops, and so was the famous "From Hell" letter, accompanied with a kidney. Part of the letter read, "I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can." It might have been a hoax, but at the same time, those missives made Jack the Ripper case explode in the global media. As you know, there were only 2 more canonical victims, and there were perhaps some more victims too, but the Ripper really should have been caught the night he committed the double murder. As Dime Shoots later said, the Ripper must have committed the act only seconds before he arrived on the scene. He wrote, "It would have been quite possible for a man to have escaped from the yard while I was driving up to the club door, but after I had told the members what I had seen, nobody, I think, could have escaped." The cops speculated that the Ripper must have seen Dime Shoots approaching, and that's when he took evasive action. In fact, they said that when Dime Shoots lit that match, it's very likely the Ripper was standing nearby in the shadows. It must have been when Dime Shoots went to get that candle that he made the escape. Think about it, if Dime Shoots hadn't gone to get the candle and instead shouted something, all those people in the club would have come out and likely discovered the killer. The Ripper wouldn't have killed again, and the case would have quickly been written off as just another set of gruesome events in a place where people were used to that kind of thing. March 11, 2004. A Canadian family in Vancouver have just finished a delicious dinner of pork loin wrapped in smoked bacon when a provincial health official appears on the TV and announces some very worrying news. That meal that they just wolfed down might have had a secret ingredient: the flesh and guts of numerous murdered women, meat that might make them seriously ill. When they heard that news, one of Canada's most prolific and demented serial killers was in custody. No thanks to the Canadian cops who seemed to always allow this guy to keep on killing. Did they? That's doubtful, but what is not doubtful is that this is one of the most disturbing, perplexing, and nauseating serial killer cases in history. A story that might contain some extremely dark secrets. Robert Pickton was a meat lover. His entire life was centered around meat, almost from the day he was born. Seems he couldn't get enough of the stuff, and he certainly wasn't too picky about where it came from. Born on October 24, 1949, Pickton cut his teeth on the family pig farm 17 miles to the east of downtown Vancouver. As with many serial killers, his childhood was far from pleasant. To understand the extremely revolting things you'll hear in this show, you need to know what shaped this madman. He wasn't always a monster. Little Robert, or Willie as he was unaffectionately known, was molded into a beast by perhaps the worst parents a boy could ever have. Willie and his young brother David grew up on the farm, while their sister Linda was sent away when she was young. Her parents said the farm life wasn't suited for a young girl. They were absolutely right. This story is about Willie, but bear in mind as we tell you this tale that his siblings might have also embraced a dark streak. Willie and David slaved away on the pig farm from a very young age. Their father, Leonard, born in England in 1896, was a very violent man. He ignored the kids as much as possible, interacting with them only to dish out the occasional physical and psychological abuse. Leonard was not a nice man, evident in one story that Willie would tell police many years later. It was about this time that he was 12 and bought a 3-week-old calf. He liked the calf and made it his pet. Then one day he came home from school and it wasn't there. He asked his dad about it and he was told, "Oh, it must have got out." Willie replied, "How can it get out the door?" His father remained silent. Willie ran to the barn where he found his half-butchered pet hanging from a meat hook. He told his mother, Louise, "I was going to keep that calf for the rest of my life and now it's gone." Crying, he told her, "I was going to sleep with it." He loved that calf, which was now a butchered piece of meat. Somewhere in the kid's mind, the trauma he experienced had connected love and violence, affection and slaughter. He would tell this story later in life as if that pet calf was the most important thing that ever happened to him. He explained to detectives that losing his beloved calf made him realize from a young age, life goes around and around. You're only here today, you're not here tomorrow. You should keep those details in mind, since Willie's actions later in life are still a matter of debate. His childhood might hold the keys to what is a very murky mystery. Unsurprisingly, these kids stayed away from their father, but their mother, Louise, born in Alberta in 1912, was also the embodiment of parental mismanagement. This gruesome guardian was loud, controlling, and obnoxious. She didn't look too good for her age, her balding head usually covered by a scarf, hair sprouting out of her chin, and her mouth containing just a few rotten teeth. She wouldn't have looked or sounded out of place in the movie Deliverance. She called Willie slow, a boy she believed was not quite right in the head, blaming the fact that when he was born, his umbilical cord had wrapped around his neck and cut off his oxygen. All she ever seemed to do was shout at him. She was often heard screaming, "Get over here, now!" and he always came running. She worked both kids like coal miners, up at dawn every day to slop out the pig feces. 200 pigs plus the 8 cows the kids had to slop out and milk in the morning. Both kids stank like something rotten, since Louise never taught them the importance of regular bathing. Willie was taunted in school for that. The other kids at Millside Elementary named him Stinky Piggy, and when he got home, he was faced with more hard work, often witness to the slaughtering of livestock. Death was always around him, but blood and guts didn't bother young Willie. When the adults were angry at him, he'd sometimes go hide under the gutted pig carcasses. Forevermore, death, blood, and viscera would for Willie be associated with safety. The Pictons were very well known in their town, Port Coquitlam, population 50,000, for having one of the biggest pig farms and slaughterhouses in the area. If you wanted pork, L.F. Picton Ranch Poultry and Pigs was the place to go. When people visited, they'd see the feral, unwashed kids running around a house that always seemed on the verge of collapse. This they couldn't understand. Everyone knew the Pictons had money from selling land. It was as if they enjoyed living in abject filth. Pigs, chicken, ducks, dogs, and the occasional cow wandered around the house, leaving dirt and excrement behind. A farmer who lived nearby later recalled, "It was just one shack after another made up of scraps of lumber. I didn't go down there, it was so repulsive." Willie, who had a good memory despite his low IQ, later recalled how when he was 2, there was no running water in the house. At that time, his bedroom was a converted chicken coop where he could lift a floorboard under his bed and get cold water from the spring below. Despite the obvious maltreatment, Louise said she loved Willie dearly. She protected him from his father. She doted on him when she wasn't treating him like a slave, feeling sorry for her boy who was put into the special education class at school due to low grades and the fact that he looked and smelled like an animal and didn't talk like other kids who wore nicer clothes. Many of those kids were the children of doctors who worked at the local Essendale mental hospital. One of them many years later admitted, "We were all terrible to the Pictons, especially Robert. No one liked Stinky Willie in school, so he was surprised one day when a girl named Lisa started being nice to him." Willie was working in the store his family had on Shaughnessy Street in Port Coquitlam, a shop they named the Meat Locker. That day, he stared at Lisa, her face slightly unique as her mother was Chinese and her father Caucasian. She smiled back at him. The smell didn't repulse her, so he gave her a free hot dog. Many years later, he'd meet Lisa again. They'd become good friends. She was probably his only friend. Lisa would also hold some of the keys that we talked about that may solve the mystery of Willie. More on that later. Rather than waste his time at school, Luis pulled him out when he was 14. He continued working at the farm and also worked as a butcher, slaving away in the back, cutting meat all day. Willie became very skilled at this. One of the pivotal moments in his life came when his brother David was 16 and learning to drive. For whatever reason, David somehow didn't see a kid walking down the road. The kid was 14-year-old Tim Barrett, who was hit so hard the truck was badly bashed up. Seemed as if David had not even slowed down or braked. Instead of doing the right thing and telling the cops, David sped off and went to tell his mother. She raced out to the accident scene, looked at the kid, who she thought was obviously dead, and rolled him into a water-filled ditch about 10 yards from the road. This had a big impact on David and Willie, who already had a warped sense of right and wrong. Tim's parents, Philip and Lois Barrett, reported their son missing. His body was found the next day. The disturbing thing about this is the autopsy revealed he died from drowning, not the injuries sustained when he was hit, although there were significant head injuries and a fractured pelvis. Even so, the pathologist said those injuries would not have killed Tim. Luis was now a killer. David was an accessory, and Willie learned a thing or two about ethics and accountability. David and his mom were both exposed in the investigation due to a mechanic telling police he'd fixed the Picton's truck. But in the end, Luis wasn't charged with a crime, and David only got 4 years probation after being sentenced at a juvenile court. Many years later, Willie would tell this story about how his mother pretty much got away with murder. In 1978, Willie's father, Leonard, passed away at the age of 91, the same year that a fire at the farm killed hundreds of pigs. Then, a year later, Luis also passed away. The kids, including the sister, inherited the land that was worth a substantial amount of money. They also each received about $90,000, around $380,000 in today's money. That was small change though. The farm and its land were now worth close to $1 million, or $4.2 million today. Willie, who was now 20, was suddenly rich, but he remained at the farm as his mother had requested in her will. Now all the animals were his. He still barely took care of the place and never really got into the old hygiene thing, but he did make some changes. One of those changes was taking care of the animals he loved. When his favorite horse, Goldie, died, he decapitated it and took the head to a taxidermist. Goldie's stuffed head was still on his bedroom wall years later when the horrors of the Picton farm came to light. Willie had never had a girlfriend. The girl in his family's meat shop, Lisa, was about the closest he'd come to falling in love. The puppy kind, at least. Willie was aware that girls were disgusted by him, the pig boy who smelled like feces. So he found pen pals. Pen pals didn't know what he smelled or looked like. Just prior to his parents dying, the teenager Willie fell for Connie Anderson, a girl he was writing to in Pontiac, Michigan. He took a few long road trips to the U.S. where he called on the pen pals in Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Louis. But it was with Connie, a rather heavy-set girl, that he found true love. The two were both oddballs and not popular amongst their peers. They didn't bother with bars and restaurants, they just drove around all the time. Willie spent 5 weeks with her, and they later got engaged despite never sleeping with each other. The only thing Willie had slept with until then was pigs he sometime had to slaughter. He seemed to have trouble differentiating women from swine, which may have been why he and Connie never reached third base. Fourth base, with Willie, usually meant the meat grinder. One night he told her he couldn't leave the farm forever. He had to go. Years later he told the police she was supposed to come up, but she never did. Neither did he ever go back to Pontiac. Well, that's life, Willie told interrogators decades later. Life comes around and goes around. And in between, for Willie at least, there's a fair amount of bloodshed and pain. He was almost ready, primed to kill, to become a slaughterer and a meat man who would shock the world. Back at the farm, Willie did something unexpected. He opened the place up to the Hells Angels gang that hung around the area. From then on, there were wild parties at the farm. The bikers turned some of it into a chop shop and held cockfights in the barns. For them, Willie was just a weirdo sitting on a lot of money. As long as he let them party, they were good to him. They called the place Piggy Palace, always dumbfounded by Willie's relationship with his pigs, especially his 600-pound boar that would run wild around the place. They called Willie weird and slow. They laughed at him behind his back, but they sure did appreciate the use of his place. It was through the bikers and the parties that Willie met many women who worked the streets and most of the rundown areas of Vancouver. They partied with the bikers, often given the substances that got them through their day. Willie was equally as kind. Well, he seemed kind at first. In the daytime, Willie would take his meat to West Coast Reduction Rendering Facility, where the non-edible parts would be rendered into grease to make soap, candy, and cosmetics. Some of it was turned into pet food. Unbeknownst to the facility, it might have been part human. At nighttime, the parties would get louder and louder. This was kind of legal. In 1996, Willie and David registered a non-profit organization they named Piggy Palace Good Times Society, stating that it was for special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions. It was more like a rave organization in which the brothers used a converted building at the pig farm for hundreds of people to party in, including a regular cast of downtown Vancouver's East Side prostitutes. One of the parties drew 1,800 people. Young folks danced away the night, oblivious to the danger they were in. It was fertile ground for a serial killer. The brothers fell foul of the law a few times, sometimes for violating city zoning ordinance and other times for holding parties with too many people and for not writing up mandatory financial statements. But Willie didn't cross in the radar of cops for his more violent proclivities until 1997, after he stabbed a prostitute named Wendy Lynn Eistetter. Willie was now 48. This woman was certainly not the first that Willie hurt, but it was the first time he got caught. He was sloppy. Her experience tells us something about how Willie worked. He picked Wendy up on the street in eastern downtown Vancouver and offered her $100. She became suspicious when she saw a bra in his van, but she went to his house, which she called a pigsty. She later said something didn't feel right. She explained, "I asked him for a telephone book and he showed me a telephone book. And as I was leaning over the desk looking up a phone number, I could feel behind me." The next thing she knew, there was a handcuff on her arm. But she fought him, managing to pick up a knife, stabbing him near his throat. He screamed, "You bleep, you got me good." He subsequently picked up a knife and stabbed her in the abdomen. The next thing she knew, they were outside fighting near his truck. He had her in his arms as she pleaded, "I have a family. I'll give you $1,000 if you let me go." She said he suddenly became heavy against her body as if he were passing out from blood loss. She ran for it, leaving him staggering in the driveway. She was picked up on the highway at 1:45 a.m., seen by the driver Ben Streleski and his girlfriend. She was handcuffed, covered in blood, and holding a knife, quite a frightening sight for the couple. The last thing Wendy remembers saying to them was, "In case I die, tell them that I stabbed him in the neck." She didn't die. Willie was charged with attempted murder and released on a $2,000 bond after telling the cops she tried to steal from him and had gone bananas in the process. A few months later, the case was dismissed, which was not unusual for cases involving so-called women of the night. The cops later had to explain this to a disgruntled public, and they admitted they dropped the cases because such women with addiction problems didn't make good witnesses. This would come back to bite the Canadian police big time. Many prostitutes went to the farm. They often knew something dark lurked amongst the piles of animal excrement and broken shacks. They'd heard about Weird Willie, who mostly kept a low profile at the parties. It was common knowledge amongst the sex workers that Piggy Palace was a dangerous place, but they went there anyway, knowing the booze and whatever else often came free, or at least for favors. When they arrived there for the first time, they were greeted by a sign at the farm entrance that read, "This property protected by pit bull with AIDS." Willie couldn't even get the English right. One woman who went there one time later said that farm was the dregs of the earth. It was a hellhole. She said women went anyway just for what was on offer. She said the cops always knew about what went on there, but they left the place alone for some reason. They could have shut it down whenever they wanted to, but they didn't. Many women who survived that farm still wonder why. In the 1980s and the 1990s, scores of women went missing in Vancouver, many of whom worked the streets at night. Such women have been called the less dead, meaning that when they die, no one really cares about them. In the eyes of society, they hardly existed when they were alive, and when they went missing, they still barely existed. They were less dead in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of conventional society, despite their vulnerability and hardships. After all, they hung out on the east side of downtown, a place known as Low Track and Canada's Skid Row. This 10-block section of the city was an absolute wasteland, where the sidewalks were covered with the rubber and spiked jetsam the women in the attics had dumped in the night. Pimps strolled among the many liquor stores and pawn shops. Biker gangs and Asian cartels openly flaunted their wares. Oddballs like Willie were invisible in this civic failure. Within those 10 blocks were the highest rates of HIV infection in the whole of North America. Young runaways, sometimes referred to as Twinkies, would often end up there. It was the last stop on the line of a broken life for many, the plug hole of society that sucked in the tormented and traumatized. No gutter was deeper and dirtier than the east side of downtown. These mean streets were a neglected and rejected gaping wound oozing human pus that presented some troubling questions about modern Western society. And because of Willie and his victims, soon those questions would have to be confronted. The women talked amongst themselves about this girl or that girl who went out for a job and never returned. The pimps started to wonder what was going on when this happened time and again. We're not talking about a handful of women here. We're talking about dozens of women over the years. One of them was Rebecca Guno, who on a hot summer's day in 1983 vanished from downtown East Side, never to be seen again. By the time Vancouver's World Fair happened in 1986, aka Expo 86, more women had gone missing. Some of them last seen at the intersection of Main and Hastings, the bottom of rock bottom. A face often seen lurking around that intersection was Willie Picton, the weird guy who held those huge parties at his rundown farm. 43-year-old Sherry Rail went missing, followed by 33-year-old Elaine Auerbach, who told her buddies that she was moving to Seattle but never arrived. Then there was Teresa Ann Williams, a 26-year-old Aboriginal woman who went missing in July 1988, but was only reported missing in March 1989. There was a hiatus of over a year until a 40-year-old psychiatric patient named Ingrid Suet vanished. In 1992, 39-year-old Kathleen Watley went missing. There was another break, and 3 years later, 47-year-old Catherine Gonzalez vanished into thin air. She wasn't reported missing until February 9, 1996. It took 7 months for 32-year-old Catherine Knight to be reported missing, who disappeared shortly before Dorothy Spence, a 36-year-old Aboriginal woman. That Christmas, 23-year-old Diana Melnick also vanished. The youngest victim at the time was Stephanie Lee, a 20-year-old woman who just vanished after being treated for psychosis. Tanya Holyoke was just 24, and Olivia Williams was just 22 when they disappeared around the same time. Unbelievably, a woman named Janet Henry survived a close call in the 80s with a serial killer named Clifford Olson, and on June 28, 1997, she also disappeared. After a 29-year-old black woman named Sarah Jane DeVries vanished in 1998, police found her diary. In it, she'd written, "I feel like I've come a long way on my journey. I feel like I've overcome a lot of stuff." Inspector Kim Rossmo of the Vancouver Police figured around 40 women had gone missing, most of them from the downtown east side. Even so, police still weren't sure the many missing women had been murdered. Rossmo employed a new geographic profiling technique, but despite the huge number of deaths, the case never became a major murder investigation. It was believed such women often go missing and then turn up in some other place like LA or Vegas. The cops were very wrong, but they didn't even have one body at this point. They had no forensic evidence. It didn't help matters that some of the sex workers and the gangs and the pimps were reluctant to speak with them, for good reason of course. The police then went to the families of some of the missing women in an attempt to obtain their DNA. They entered the DNA into databases in North America, trying to match it with the DNA of Jane Doe's from Alberta to Arizona. They checked the hospitals, mental health facilities, drug rehabilitation facilities, and witness protection programs, and they came up empty-handed. These women really had vanished off the face of the planet. And as the years passed, 97, 98, 99, more women disappeared. Julie Young, aged 31, Angela Jardine, 28, Michelle Gurney, 30, Marcella Creason, 20. The latter was released from jail on December 27, 1998, and was not seen after. Her mother and her boyfriend waited for her at their apartment, where they cooked her a belated Christmas feast. Some men were questioned, men who had a history of violence, but none of them, it seemed, had anything to do with the disappearances. The cops checked the Downtown East Side Youth Activities Society's bad date file, where women had filed many pages regarding men to avoid. Willie's name was not on that list, mostly because if you met him, you were dead. One thing the police should have done is listen to 37-year-old Bill Hiscox. This widower had almost lost his life through alcohol after his wife passed, but his sister saved him when she helped him land a job at P&B Salvage in Surrey, southeast of Vancouver. The owners of this firm were Robert William Willie Picton and David Picton. When Hiscox collected his weekly paychecks, he had to go to the Port Coquitlam pig farm, which he later described as a creepy-looking place where the equally creepy and quiet Willie Picton parked his beloved converted bus with deeply tinted windows. But what bothered Hiscox was the wild parties and the fact that so many sex workers turned up there. He'd read about the missing women in the newspapers, and then when he heard about Willie's stabbing charge, he thought about something else. What he told the police hotline was all the purses and IDs that are out there in his trailer and stuff. Hiscox first gave that information to the hotline anonymously, but later he met with a detective, a man we'll discuss in detail later. That detective told him that he'd pushed the investigation all the way to the top of the police force, but after that cop was transferred off the case, the brothers were filed as persons of interest and left alone. The farm was not surveilled, which was a god-awful pity because Willie took a lot more women there in the 90s. In fact, cops were now pulling up names of missing women. There must have been over 50. Even so, it seemed at times the Vancouver Sun newspaper cared more about those women than the police. The cops were still unwilling to call this a serial murder case. If it were, it would have been the worst serial killing case in Canada's history. It took until 2001 for the police to finally form the Missing Women Task Force. By now, they had 54 missing women, possibly as many as 70, who'd all disappeared from the same area in the 80s and 90s. And so, 18 years too late, Canada's largest murder investigation finally began. Even so, they still issued a statement to the public saying, "We're in no way saying there's a serial murderer out there. We're in no way saying that all these people missing are dead." It seemed to many people at the time, especially the women still working the streets, that the cops didn't want to admit they'd allowed a serial killer to remain loose for almost 2 decades. The Picton men's names stood out, both of whom had a rap sheet. They then looked at a 1998 report when Bill Hiscox had phoned Crime Stoppers about the farm. 14 more women had gone missing since then. Police noted that Hiscox had accused Willie of being a sicko. He told them in 1998 about those 10 purses he'd seen with his own eyes, and he explained that Willie had once bragged about being able to easily dispose of bodies. He explained a friend of Willie's, the mixed-race Chinese-Caucasian woman named Lisa Yelds, had told him that she'd seen women's bloody clothing at the farm, as well as various women's belongings. This was Free Hot Dog Lisa from Willie's childhood. She suggested to Hiscox that the belongings might be Willie's trophies. Even worse, Hiscox heard that Willie got rid of these women with his meat grinder and possibly sold the meat to the public. That might have sounded like too much of a tall story back to the cops in '98, but in 2001, they realized they should look into this again. It wasn't until 2002 that there was a breakthrough, and even that was accidental. A rookie police officer was the first policeman to find something notable on the farm. It seemed the homicide detectives were still stalling, but this rookie cop got a warrant to search the farm for illegal guns, not pieces of ground-up women. He found the guns, but he also found a bunch of personal items belonging to women, including an asthma inhaler on which was printed the name of one of the missing women. So it was this young cop, who wasn't even on the murder case, that was the cause of the subsequent forensic search of the entire farm. A farm, by the way, that was worth about $70 million. Why this guy lived in such squalor, police just couldn't fathom. What they eventually found at the farm were the remains of at least 27 women, parts of them in the freezers and lots of them mulched up into pig feed. Worse, it seemed to cops that Willie had used human flesh and whatever other parts for pork products. Even so, it wasn't until 2004 that officials appeared on TV warning Canadians they might well have become unwitting cannibals. "Don't worry," said one official, explaining that they'd probably not get sick from it and they'd only possibly contract hepatitis B if they hadn't cooked the pork well enough. Given the size of Willie's operation, there were a lot of sick Canadians for a few weeks after that announcement, especially when the Canadian government ordered a federal health risk assessment study to understand if people who ate the part human meat could have come into contact with viruses, bacteria, and parasites, or contracted diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. Both these diseases were very common in Vancouver among the highly stigmatized prostitutes. They concluded the risk was low to medium, but that didn't make people feel much better. Willie had been murdering and selling meat products for 20 years, so God knows how many people were reluctant cannibals if he had put victims into his products. It was a great time to be a vegetarian in the Vancouver area. People asked how the hell police had let this go on for so long. They'd heard about Hiscox and the fact that many women had died after he told police what he knew. Maggie Guile, known on the streets as Crazy Jackie, told the press 27 of her buddies were confirmed murdered and over 50 were missing. She added, "There are many more that the police won't add to the list. Whole buildings of women have disappeared, but no one's looking for them." Many of the victims weren't white, which led to accusations of racism and sexism. One thing was for certain, those women were less dead in the eyes of the cops. Now let's talk about Willie's interrogation. At the station, Willie is quiet, giving 1 or 2 word answers to questions, only to explode with vivid descriptions of his past when he starts to talk about his dead calf or how his father was harsh with him. To his interrogators, he seems a few sandwiches short of a picnic, as the saying goes. Willie refers to himself as the pig man. seemingly impressed when telling investigators repeatedly that his face is in the newspapers. At one point, he stares at the poster board with pictures of dozens of missing women he supposedly murdered and churned up. After being asked about them, he turns to Sergeant Bill 40 and says, "There's so many millions of people out there. They look so much alike, and everything else you know." Then he starts talking about how he was once mauled by a bull and another time chased by a black bear. Instead of discussing the case, he explains to the bemused cops, "That was a scary feeling, that one," referring to the bull attack. "Turn the other hoof, and if your arm's out there, rip your arm right off." Talking about once trying to split up two boars while fighting over a sow in heat, he excitedly explains, "I got in between them, and then they went after me. Got all slashed up." What on earth did the police have on their hands here? "Those are the good old days," Willie says. "Those are the days when I could say I got scars and really enjoyed myself, all black and blue." Detective 40 cuts in. "You do know you're never going back to that farm or that life." Willie then says there's nothing he likes about the farm anyway. Meanwhile, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were saying that in the last 2 decades, 144 prostitutes had been murdered or are missing in British Columbia, with foul play suspected. Soon, Vancouver will be sued for not doing their job. Families of victims will come forward to reprimand the cops, who certainly would not have acted in the same fashion had scores of middle-class women gone missing. The farm was fenced off as forensics did their job. It was thought many of the bodies had already been eaten or were possibly sitting in someone's freezer somewhere, in parts anyway. In Willie's house, they found what looked like instruments of torture, kinky devices, and syringes filled with liquid. They found parts of a woman in a wood chipper. It seemed that Willie had strangled most of them, possibly after knocking them out with a substance, maybe windshield cleaner, after which he slaughtered them the same way he did his pigs. According to the court transcripts, he told an undercover police officer, "I filled the syringes up with antifreeze, and you inject this stuff and you're dead in about 5 to 10 minutes. He also likely shot some of the victims, and many of them had their bones cut with Willie's handheld reciprocating saw. But many of the women, the very last shreds of them, were missing completely, leading some people to question if Slow Willie was being set up. Canadian news outlets did not discuss the very worst details. AP issued a report asking anyone who may still have frozen pork products from Picton's farm to return those products to the police. More shock followed when a woman named Lynn Ellingson came forward and said she'd once seen Willie skinning a woman hanging from a meat hook. She was blackmailed by Willie and didn't say anything anyway out of fear for her life, but the friend at the time had tipped off the police. This friend told them that Willie made strange meat, and he explained in detail how Ellingson had seen Willie strip a body down. She told him she was surprised when she saw that human fat was yellow, not white. The testimony sounded like the real thing. Detective Constable Lorimer Shenner was the one who took the tip and the one who'd first dealt with Hiscox in 1998. But he said as much as he wanted to search the farm, he couldn't because it fell under the jurisdiction of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They apparently talked with Ellingson on 2 occasions, but each time she remained silent. Shenner later said that the RCMP visited the farm but were told to come back when Willie and David weren't so busy. For whatever reason, they actually did that. They interviewed Willie again, and he told them that they could search the farm, but according to Shenner, they never even returned. God knows why. The investigation was botched, with a capital B. Shenner said he had nightmares because of those missing women, and later he had to be taken off the case due to PTSD. This also slowed the investigation down, as Shenner was on to Willie more than anyone else was. In total, there were more than 40,000 photos taken of the crime scene. 235,000 items were taken from the farm, while the lab received a massive 600,000 exhibits. For the prosecution, 98 testified, and another 30 testified for the defense. It was a long and gruesome trial. Willie admitted to killing 49 women, but not at trial. He told an undercover officer while in custody that he wanted to make it 50. He was charged with killing 26 and convicted of just 6 murders. He was found innocent of first-degree murder but guilty of second-degree murder, likely because the jury didn't think the prosecution had proved beyond any reasonable doubt that he'd planned the murders. The Deputy Chief Constable of the Vancouver Police Department apologized, saying in a statement, "I wish from the bottom of my heart that we would have caught him sooner. I wish that all the mistakes that were made we could undo, and I wish that more lives would have been saved." More people came forward to say they knew Willie. Some had survived the usually deadly encounter with him. In 1985, he picked out a sex worker named Tracy Bunyan. He took her back to the disgusting trailer, which she immediately saw was stacked with women's clothes. Willie physically hurt her, but then drove her back to the city, warning her on the way that he was giving her one more chance to clean up her act or she was getting it like the others. His belief that he was helping women was just an excuse to justify his perverted, murderous acts. There were other survivors, such as Lenore, not her real name, a self-described hardcore alcoholic who was in and out of foster homes all her childhood, experiencing the most horrific kind of existence a child could have. She said Willie picked her up in a white van, but when she saw the rear seats had been removed, she knew something was wrong. She asked him to stop the car, but he kept driving, and in the end, she had to jump out. She later saw Willie's face in the newspaper. In 2007, Judge Justice James Williams sentenced Willie to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years, meaning his parole date is coming up soon, in 2035. Willie is 73 now, currently serving out a sentence at Port Cartier Maximum Security Prison in Quebec, where he still claims he's innocent. In 2008, David Picton and Linda Wright sued the Attorney General and Solicitor General of British Columbia. They said the police destroyed much of the farm in their search, saying they disturbed, disrupted, killed, and destroyed various plants, trees, ground covers, and other vegetation. They'd been pretty quiet about their brother, which isn't surprising given that the 4 children of 4 victims had sued them, saying they knew all along what their brother was doing on that farm. Many serious allegations have been made against David over the years, but he's denied everything and filed statements of defense. In 2016, the book Willie wrote in prison, titled Picton in His Own Words, was published after the manuscript was smuggled out of the prison. The book was soon withdrawn due to the public outcry. In the book, he claimed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police made him a fall guy for the murders. He stated that some of the body parts found on his farm were in cars he'd bought at a police auction, and that some women were killed by the Hells Angels when he held those parties. He even claimed that the blood of one victim that police found on a mattress was nothing but spilled wallpaper glue. But before the book was taken down, a reviewer said it was incoherent, illiterate ranting, while another reviewer said it is tedious and boring drivel filled with tirades against the police, asinine theories about the Hells Angels. Nothing Willie says in the book sounds remotely true, but he has some conspiracy theorists on his side. They've asked why did the Vancouver cops not investigate the case for so long, even when they'd been told about the women's purses and a sicko who stripped the flesh of a woman. Why wasn't the farm at least put under police surveillance? If he murdered 49 or even 26, they say it's strange that even with the most advanced forensics equipment, they could only convict Willie of 6 murders. Willie himself managed to write to people from prison. In one of the letters filled with umpteen spelling mistakes, he said, "I, myself, is not from this world, but I am born into this world through my earthly mother, and if I had to change anything, I would not, for I have done no wrong." He also kept writing to the Canadian media, making cryptic claims that there was more to the story than everyone knew. Still, he never managed to convince anyone he was innocent. Willie was also a compulsive liar. He once told a cellmate that as a killer, he was bigger than the ones in the States, likely in reference to the likes of serial killers John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy. This might have been one time that he told the truth. What kind of people did the Venezuelan people eater refuse to eat? How much does a lock of Charlie Manson's hair cost? And what were the scariest serial killer's last words? All this and more on this episode of the Infographics Show. 50 insane facts about serial killers you didn't know. Number 50. One of history's most notorious killers wasn't actually a serial killer. Ed Gein, a murderer and body snatcher operating in Wisconsin in the 1950s, has cast a long dark shadow over pop culture. The Butcher of Plainfield has inspired silver screen killers like Norman Bates from Psycho, Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So you would think that he'd have an impressive body count. But Ed Gein was only confirmed to have killed 2 people, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. All of the other mutilated bodies in his house were stolen from 3 local graveyards. Number 49. The worst serial killer in history was a guy they called the Beast. And that was a title that Luis Garavito earned, as this Colombian serial killer is believed to have killed at least 189 people in the 1990s. Most of these were young homeless people that nobody would look for. Garavito's initial sentence was over 1,800 years, which was reduced to 22 years after he gave up the details of where he buried many of his victims. Thankfully, he died in 2023 before he could get parole. Number 48. One of America's smartest serial killers got caught in the dumbest way. Dennis Rader was better known for decades as the mysterious serial killer BTK, short for Bind, Torture, Kill. He sadistically murdered at least 10 women in Kansas over the 70s and 80s. He used his skills as a home security technician to sneak into the homes of his victims, where he would torment and murder them for his own cruel glee. For years after the killing stopped, Rader kept sending letters to the police, often to Detective Ken Landwehr, taunting them and boasting about his intelligence. In one message, he asked whether a floppy disk could be traced. Landwehr responded through a newspaper ad, falsely assuring him it was safe. Believing it, Rader sent a disk to a local TV station. Investigators examined the metadata and traced it back to a computer at a church. From there, it led them straight to Rader. Nice going, Dennis. Number 47. Bela Kiss pickled at least 23 women and got away with it. This Hungarian serial killer lured in women and strangled them before relieving them of their personal goods. And after killing them, he shoved their bodies into large metal drums in his home that he told others were barrels full of gasoline. Never know when you need it, right? Like many men in Europe at the time, he was conscripted to fight in World War I. While he was away, the owner of Kiss's home thought it was the perfect opportunity to do some redecorating. He and a neighbor stepped into Kiss's workshop looking for materials. They found the drums and inside the pickled women Kiss had killed. And the killers coming up make Kiss look like a pussycat. Number 46. A real-life vampire could only get in if you let him. Richard Chase, a serial killer nicknamed the Vampire of Sacramento, was a truly messed up dude. He killed 6 people believing that drinking their blood and consuming their flesh was the only way to stop his own blood from drying up. And like a vampire, he also had some weird hang-ups about the victims he selected. Chase was a home invader, but said that he only walked into homes that were unlocked. He would roam around and just try door handles, and if the door opened, he'd assume that he was welcome. Speaking of cannibals. Number 45. The Venezuelan people eater was really picky about the people he ate. Doraniel Vargas was a cannibalistic serial killer who killed 14 people and devoured 11 of them in San Cristobal in the mid-1990s. But he only ever ate the flesh of men. He thought that women and children were too pure to eat and worried that eating fat people would be bad for his health. Number 44. A killer journalist got put away by his own story. Vlado Taneski, a small-town Macedonian journalist, committed a brutal string of murders against elderly women in the town of Kisivo. Inexplicably, he decided to report on his own murders and immediately had the police after him because he reported on insider details that they had never released. Number 43. The butcher Baker hunted women like deer in the wilderness. Robert Hansen, a serial killer based in Alaska, was a sadistic monster of the highest order, killing at least 17 women and abusing many more. But the most unique thing about his murder spree was that he would drive women out into the frozen wastes near Anchorage, where he would hunt them down with a Ruger Mini 14 hunting rifle and his favorite hunting knives. And he is still a nicer dude than our next monster. Number 42. Jeffrey Dahmer worked at a chocolate factory. That's right, the infamous Milwaukee cannibal was employed on the night shift at Ambrosia Chocolate Company in 1985, working for $8.75 an hour. He was working there when he was first arrested by the police in 1982, and then sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in a jail with work release. After that, he continued to work at the factory until being fired for good in 1991, likely because he missed one too many shifts due to all the murdering. Number 41. Ted Bundy consulted on the case of an even worse serial killer. During the rampage of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, Ted Bundy offered to help the investigative task force from his own prison cell. Bundy offered an insight into the mind of a serial killer, using his own experience to predict what moves the new murderer might make next. But why? David Reichert, one of the investigators, speculated, quote, "I think he was jealous that the Green River Killer was grabbing all the headlines at the time. Bundy craved attention and control. He was prideful when discussing his killings." Number 40. The deadliest doctor in history killed at least 284 people over 30 years. Dr. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death and the Angel of Death, was a British general practitioner who killed scores of sick and elderly patients to alternatingly line his pockets and satisfy his God complex. Shipman took a thrill in having the power over life and death, and as someone who was often working with vulnerable people who placed absolute trust in his care, he had the ability to kill in plain sight. He was so hard to catch because he was generally excellent at making his murders, which he committed with either tactical drug overdoses or abnormal prescriptions, seem like deaths by natural causes. Number 39. The crossbow cannibal did murder homework for years before killing. You probably haven't heard of Stephen Sean Griffiths, a British serial killer who killed at least 3 sex workers. But the worst part is all of the ignored red flags before Griffiths started murdering. In his teenage years, he assaulted multiple people with a knife and spent some time in jail. He expressed fantasies about growing up to become a serial killer. Then in 2009, he took a PhD in homicide studies at university, and while the police were keeping an eye on him, he was seen buying hunting weapons and reading books about dismemberment. But he still wasn't stopped in advance, and he still took at least 3 lives. Number 38. One Australian serial killer risked it all for a PlayStation. Ivan Milat, also known as the Backpack Killer, was a sadistic outback psychopath who tortured and killed tourists that he encountered in the Australian bush. He's also one of the inspirations behind Mick Taylor, the terrifying killer from the Wolf Creek franchise. He was arrested and put away for life in 1996, but later in 2011, he demanded a PlayStation in his cell to help him exercise his mind. And when the prison refused him, he went on a hunger strike for 9 days before giving up and eating again. We guess he didn't really want that PlayStation all that much. Number 37. Murderbilia is a thriving industry, and that is exactly what it sounds like. People make huge bucks online selling off memorabilia from serial killers to bizarre collectors for a hell of a lot of money. A starting bid of $2,500 was posted on a lock of Charles Manson's hair, and you could buy a John Wayne Gacy painting of an owl for $1,300 on murderauction.com, a real website. Killers aren't allowed to profit off their own crimes, though, due to the Son of Sam, or notoriety for profit law. And speaking of the Son of Sam, number 36. The Son of Sam wasn't really told to kill by a demon dog. David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam because of the deranged letters he sent during the middle of his year-long killing spree from July 1976 to July 1977, is one of the most infamous killers of the 70s, and that's a pretty stacked lineup. It was often repeated that Berkowitz was a psychotic Satanist who hallucinated a demonic dog that told him to kill. However, Berkowitz himself would later confess that this was an attempt to throw investigators off the trail. In reality, his only motivation was revenge on a world that rejected him. But somehow, this next motive seems even nastier. Number 35. The Polish skin hunters killed patients for cash. A group of 4 doctors and paramedics, Andrzej Nowotny, Karol Banash, Janusz Kulinski, and Paweł Wasilewski, murdered at least 5 patients with muscle relaxant overdoses in the city of Łódź. What was the motive? They were being bribed by competing funeral homes to deliver patient information, so they could then contact the grieving families before their funeral home competition. It's the deadliest grind set you can possibly imagine. But their numbers are nothing compared to our next group of killers. Number 34. The Angel Makers of Nagyrev were a Hungarian familicide cult. These killers are little known outside of their home country, but they caused quite a stir when they were captured in 1929. It was revealed that they had slain anywhere from 45 to 300 victims. They were all men, generally husbands, parents, and even sons of the group's almost 30 members, and they were all poisoned with arsenic. The mastermind of the group was midwife Zuzanna Farziekasz, who supplied the arsenic to her devotees and talked them into slipping it into their victims' food and drink. Number 33. Was there a real werewolf serial killer in the 1500s? Back in Germany in the mid to late 16th century, there was a series of attacks so gruesome that superstitious locals and authorities thought that they could only be the work of a werewolf. Sightings of a large wolf with a single paw had also been reported. In the end, the trial went back to Peter Stump, a local oddball with only one hand, who the authorities believed had been practicing black magic to become a wolf. They tortured Peter, and when he confessed, he was given one of the most gruesome executions imaginable, death by breaking wheel. But there's plenty more gruesomeness to come. Number 32. The Russian chessboard killer wanted to be number 1. Alexander Pichushkin is a pretty messed up guy. He sustained a traumatic head injury at a young age, and as a result, he developed poor impulse control and emotional regulation. But that didn't stop him from being ambitious, and that ambition was to be the most prolific serial killer in Russian history. He brutally murdered at least 49 people, generally beating them to death with a hammer, but claimed he killed around 60 to 63. And the even more messed up thing, he may have achieved his dream after all. Number 31. A mayor helped a notorious serial killer get away with it. During the bloody reign of Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, in 1985, police got a major break in the case when they found a usable shoe print at one of the victims' homes. They were able to discern both the type of shoe and the shoe size of the home-invading killer, making it easier to narrow him down. But then Mayor Dianne Feinstein made the terrible decision to do a press conference, letting the public know that they now had this information. Naturally, the Night Stalker switched his shoes in response. Number 30. The Shankill Butchers were the scariest killers of the Irish Troubles. Made up of 12 vicious paramilitary killers, the group was famed for the brutal and remorseless killings against Catholics and enemy paramilitaries during the Troubles. Many of them were able to use their connections to escape legal consequences, but their violence came to an end when their leader, Lenny Murphy, was shot dead in 1982. Our next killer, however, never faced any kind of justice. Number 29. The Stone Man is one of India's worst serial killers, and we still don't know who he is. The name was given for two different series of killings that took place in Calcutta and Mumbai in the 1980s. With eerily similar modus operandi, the killer would approach sleeping homeless people and attack them with a large stone. Nobody was ever caught in connection with the case. Number 28. José Antonio Rodríguez Vega was a Spanish serial murderer called the Old Lady Killer. He managed to get away with many of his murders by putting his victims back in bed after killing them, making it look like they died of natural causes. But torturing and killing old ladies didn't make him popular in jail. His fellow inmates stabbed him 113 times, killing him. Number 27. As of 2024, America is number 1 in serial killers. The US has had more of these vicious criminals than any other country, with a recorded total of 3,600. The second best, Russia, by comparison, has only 196. Number 26. The death penalty doesn't deter serial killers. Many criminal profilers and criminal psychologists believe that serial killers are so wrapped up in the fantasy of their crimes, most of them simply assume they would never be caught. And as of 2020, the murder rate in death penalty states is higher than the murder rate in non-death penalty states. Number 25. The McDonald Triad shouldn't be taken so seriously. This concept of 3 serial killer childhood signifiers, bedwetting into the teen years, arson, and cruelty to animals has long been repeated as the early warning signs of a budding serial killer. But this is more anecdotal than anything. While some serial killers have shown these traits, there's nothing certain saying that someone showing these traits will become a serial killer. Number 24. Yugoslavia's most prolific serial killer was an elderly witch. Ana de Pistoia was better known as Baba Anushka, or the Witch of Vladimirovac. She was a self-styled wise woman who made love potions for her female clientele in the early 1900s. She was also, as it turned out, a prolific poisoner. Anushka's poisoned tinctures took anywhere from 50 to 100 lives, but when she was arrested, she only spent 8 years in prison before being released due to old age. She died free at 100 years old in 1938. Speaking of killers going free. Number 23. One of history's worst serial killers was let out on good behavior. Pedro Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes for his brutal murder of potentially 300 young women in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, is widely known as one of the most prolific serial killers in history. But he spent 14 years in jail because due to overcrowding and good behavior, he was released in 1994. Nobody knows where he's been since. Number 22. There were over 100 people considered suspects for Jack the Ripper murders, including a member of the British royal family. No wonder they never caught him. Number 21. Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder at 18 years old. His first victim was another 18-year-old called Stephen Hicks, whom Dahmer picked up while he was hitchhiking. After spending the night together, Dahmer beat him, strangled him, and dismembered his body. It would be almost a decade before Dahmer killed again. Number 20. The world's first true serial killer might have been a woman from ancient Rome. Locusta of Gaul was the mad Emperor Nero's favorite poisoner. Among what was likely many murders, she's believed to have been the person behind the assassinations of 2 different emperors, Britannicus and Claudius. However, after Nero's death, she was executed by his successor, Emperor Galba, who reigned for only 7 months. Number 19. The Toy Box Killer had a torture orientation tape. David Parker Ray was one bad man. He captured, tortured, and likely killed a large number of women in a custom trailer he kept behind his home. To save needing to explain to each captive what he intended to do with them, he recorded an audio tape that detailed the horrific things he'd do to her over the course of her capture. He died before he could ever go to prison for his crimes. Number 18. Leonarda Cianciulli turned her victims into tea cakes to save her son's life. Also known as the soap maker of Correggio, Leonarda claimed that a prophecy from a fortune teller foretold the deaths of all her children. And after many of her children did die, she went mad with grief. When her latest son was drafted into World War II, she decided that the only way to keep him alive was to perform human sacrifices. And that's why she murdered 3 women and turned their body into soap or tea cakes. Number 17. Canada's boozing barber used alcohol as a weapon. Gilbert Paul Jordan was a serial killer who mainly targeted First Nations women, some of them sex workers, and paid them to binge drink excessively for his own sexual gratification. Once they passed out, he poured more alcohol down their throats until they died of alcohol intoxication. He was able to get away with it for years because many of the women he preyed on were alcoholics, so it seemed like their deaths were pure accidents. No such misunderstandings could have been made with our next killer. Number 16. Gary Heidnik had a torture pit in his basement. As one of the other inspirations for Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, it won't surprise you to hear that Heidnik had a deep pit where he kept his victims, specifically to torment them. According to the FBI agent John Douglas, whose career was the basis for the Mindhunter series, Heidnik would fill the pit up with water and not drown his victims, but have them stand in the water up to their necks and then get electric wire and torture them while they were still in the water. Number 15. Amelia Dyer was a serial killer who just went after the young. The Victorian nightmare was nicknamed the Ogress of Reading. She made her living adopting unwanted orphans for cash, but rather than taking care of them, she just murdered them, with 6 murders confirmed but with around 200 to 400 suspected. This murderous career earned her a short trip on the end of a hangman's noose. Number 14. Albert Fish sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims. This guy, also known as the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria, was an absolute freak, even by serial killer standards. He was a sadist and a masochist who did unthinkable things to his many victims, and after he murdered 10-year-old Grace Budd, he sent a letter to the girl's mother, in which he painstakingly described kidnapping and murdering her. He would later be executed for his crimes on the electric chair in 1936. Number 13. Israel Keyes faked a hostage being alive for ransom money. Keyes was nothing less than a psychopathic mastermind, a serial killer, robber, and a kidnapper. His last confirmed victim was 18-year-old Samantha Tesla Koenig, whom he murdered after stealing her debit card. Sometime after she was already dead, he applied makeup to her corpse and propped her eyes open with fishing wire. He used this photo of the seemingly alive Koenig to obtain a ransom from her parents before cutting her body to pieces. And if you can believe it, the worst is still yet to come. Number 12. The Ukrainian Hammer maniacs took snuff films of their brutal murders. These sadistic Ukrainian youths murdered 21 people over the course of their 2007 killing spree, and some of these murders were filmed. Local media claimed that the killers were going to be paid by an anonymous but wealthy foreign website owner. One of their tortures and murders, that of 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko, was released onto the internet under the title 3 Guys, 1 Hammer. This, along with photos of them killing animals and even flipping off the gravestones of their victims in disrespectful selfies, cemented these maniacs as some of the most evil killers of the post-millennium. Number 11. Nobody ever caught the Doodler. This was the somewhat embarrassing name of a San Francisco serial killer who committed at least 6 but as many as 16 murders between January 1974 and September 1975. He had an unusual MO. He enjoyed sketching his victims before brutally stabbing them to death. Part of the reason the Doodler slipped through the cracks was that his targets were all gay men, and American cops in the 70s didn't really look that hard as a result. Number 10. About 1 in 4 serial killers operate with killing partners. These can range from the organized murder rings we discussed throughout the video to the killer couples like Fred and Rose West, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, and Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. The couples that slay together stay together. Number 9. Ever wonder which U.S. states have the most and the least serial killers? According to the World Population Review, as of 2025, California ranks as the top home of serial killers in the United States, with just under 1,800 people having been killed by serial murder in the state from 1992 to 2019. The lowest ranking state in terms of serial killers is South Dakota, where only 10 people have been killed by serial killers in that same time frame. We'll leave it to you whether you want to factor that into your travel plans. Number 8. Carl Panzram was a terrifying serial killer with some weirdly stubborn last words. Panzram was one of the most vicious killers who ever wandered the United States, whose lust for violence and hatred for all of humanity seemed to charge his endless rampage. He was confirmed to have killed at least 5 people for personal gratification, but is suspected of killing around or over 100. In the end, he was brought to justice and sentenced to death for his crimes. As he was taken to the gallows for execution in 1930, he was asked about his last words, and he said to the hangman, "Yes, hurry it up. I could kill 12 men while you're screwing around." Number 7. One killer wrote a book so good it got him out of jail. Jack Unterberger was an artistic, intellectual type who also loved coldly murdering women by strangling them with their own underwear. After being first caught and jailed for doing this in 1976, he seemed to turn over a new leaf in prison and wrote a book called Purgatory, which inspired a 1988 film adaptation. The Austrian literary community campaigned for his release and successfully got Jack out of jail. He would later become a successful novelist, journalist, playwright, and general intellectual celebrity, all while continuing to kill several more women before later being recaptured. Number 6. The Axeman of New Orleans terrorized the Big Easy between May 1918 and October 1919. This terrifying murderer was never caught, as he snuck into people's homes at night and brutally bludgeoned them to death with an axe. Nobody really knows why he did it, but one anonymous letter that was attributed to him in local papers claimed that he was a great lover of jazz and that he wouldn't kill anyone who was playing the music. Much like the famous From Hell Ripper letter, we can't know if the killer really did write it. But on the night that the local music halls did all decide to play jazz, there were no recorded murders. Number 5. The police thought that Ed Kemper's confession was a prank. Ed Kemper, the gigantic and shockingly intelligent co-ed killer, murdered 10 people, including his grandparents and his mother. He also loved to hang out at the local cop bar, where he befriended many of the officers who were investigating him. After murdering his mother, he decided enough was enough, and he chose to turn himself in. The police thought he was joking, until he provided insider details on the murders that only the killer would know. And then they realized they'd been knocking back beers with a crazed murderer all along. And here's a little bonus fact on Kemper. Since going to jail, he's voiced hundreds of audiobooks for the visually impaired. Number 4. The Moors Murders tape made people in the courtroom cover their ears in horror. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were a sadistic serial killer couple who terrorized Britain in the 1960s. They kidnapped, tortured, and murdered their victims, often recording audio of the attacks so they could relive the horror again and again. One victim, Leslie Ann Downey, had her murder recorded on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. This tape was played at the trial, causing everyone in attendance deep psychological trauma, with many of them requiring psychological counseling afterwards. Number 3. Haj Mohammed Mesfui was a Moroccan serial killer who's believed to have killed over 36 women by luring them into his shop. However, when he was caught in 1906, he came to a truly sticky end. The local government bricked him up into a wall, trapping him, where he died of either dehydration or starvation. Number 2. The Rainy Night Butcher got caught because he sent evidence to his local photo store. Lam Kor Wong, Hong Kong's most infamous serial killer, was one sick guy. In the course of killing at least 4 victims, he took pictures of his whole depraved routine. The problem was, these were pictures he took on a film camera, and he had the galaxy brain idea to send these off to a commercial photo development studio. Naturally, they tipped off the police, and Lam will never be free again. And somehow, the next killer manages to be even more despicably sadistic. Number 1. Robert Berdella, the Kansas City butcher, loved experimenting with different torture methods on at least 6 victims. One of his favorite methods was having his victims swallow drain cleaner, burning their vocal cords and preventing them from screaming for help. He even kept the skull of one of his victims, later confirmed to be Robert Sheldon, in his closet, known as his gallery. Now check out how the Trailside Killer changed the way the FBI hunts serial killers. Or watch this instead.